There is a sound that water makes when it moves through pipes inside the walls of a building at night. Not a dramatic sound. Not the kind of thing that wakes you up or makes you reach for the light switch. It is more like a murmur, a low conversation happening somewhere behind the surfaces of the room you are in, between the plaster and the framing, in the hidden architecture that makes ordinary living possible. You have heard this sound 1,000 times without registering it, because the ear learns to file certain things away in the category of sounds that do not require attention. The hum of the refrigerator, the settling of the house on its foundation as temperatures shift, the faint electrical buzz of something charging somewhere in the room, a clock ticking, if you still own a clock that ticks, background, texture, and the ambient signature of a space that is functioning as it was designed to function, with you inside it. But tonight, if you're quiet enough, and if the room cooperates by being quiet enough alongside you, you might notice the water. Not because it means anything, it does not. The pipes are doing what pipes do. The water is going where water goes, through channels that were installed years ago by someone whose name you do not know, following paths that were determined by building codes and the practical geometry of plumbing, paths you have never seen and will never see, because they exist behind the walls, in the spaces between the spaces where you live. The water moves through these hidden passages and you hear it, or you do not hear it, and either way it continues. That is where this starts, not with ships, not yet. Not with the ocean or the things the ocean has swallowed over the centuries, or the particular quality of silence that follows a vessel that departs from one port and never arrives at the next. All of that is coming. But it starts here, with you, lying somewhere in whatever room you are in, at whatever hour of the night this happens to find you. An hour when the reasonable thing to do would be to close your eyes and let the thinking stop. But the thinking has not stopped. Something in the mind is still turning over, still reaching for the next thought, still not quite willing to set everything down and trust the dark to hold it. So instead of fighting that, instead of lying here in the silence arguing with your own wakefulness, let us go somewhere together, slowly, without urgency, and the kind of going where you do not need to pack anything or remember anything or arrive anywhere by a particular time. Let us follow the water, not the water in the pipes, farther than that. Out through the walls of the room, past the street, past the structures and the lights and the geography that separates you from the coast, past whatever distance lies between where you are right now and the nearest shoreline, to the place where the land stops being land and starts being something else entirely. The edge of the ocean is one of those boundaries that the body recognizes before the mind has time to name it. You have felt it if you have ever stood on a beach at night, or on a cliff overlooking open water, or on a dock at the end of a harbour where the lights of the town do not quite reach. There is a change in the air, a change in the sound. Something opens up. The space in front of you stops being the kind of space that buildings and roads and human infrastructure have organised into something navigable, and becomes instead a space that is simply there, enormous and ungoverned, operating on principles that have nothing to do with you. The wind comes off of it carrying salt and a temperature that belongs to something much larger than the local weather, and if it is dark, if the sun has set and the horizon has dissolved into the general blackness of a night without a moon, then what you are looking at is, in a very real sense, nothing. An absence of visible things that extends for thousands of miles in every direction, populated by water that is moving in ways you cannot see, at depths you cannot fathom, carrying within itself a history of everything that has ever passed through it, or sunk into it, or been taken by it and not returned. The ocean covers roughly 71% of the Earth's surface. You have heard that number before. It appears in textbooks and nature documentaries and the sort of trivia that accumulates at the edges of general knowledge without ever being examined closely. 71%. It is familiar to the point of meaninglessness, the way any number becomes meaningless when you have encountered it enough times without ever being asked to feel what it describes. But tonight, lying here in the particular stillness that belongs to very late hours, It might be worth letting that number settle for a moment. 71% is most of it. Most of the planet you live on is water, not half, not a slim majority, an overwhelming majority. Don't the continents, all of them, every land mass on Earth, the mountains and the deserts and the plains and the cities and the forests and everything that has ever been built on solid ground, all of that fits inside the remaining 29%. The ocean is the main thing, the land is what is left over, and beneath that water is a darkness that does not wait for nightfall. Even at noon on the brightest day, in the calmest sea, below a certain depth, the light gives out. The exact depth depends on the clarity of the water, on how much sediment and plankton and dissolved matter is suspended in it. In the clearest tropical waters, sunlight can penetrate to maybe 200 meters, which sounds deep until you remember that the average depth of the ocean is 3,688 meters, and the deepest point in the Mariana Trench in the Western Pacific reaches down more than 11,000 meters, which means that the vast majority of the ocean, by volume, exists in permanent darkness, a darkness that has never been interrupted by light, a darkness that was there before anything alive existed to notice it, and that will be there long after the last creature capable of noticing darkness has ceased to exist. Ships cross the surface of this darkness. They have been crossing it for thousands of years. For as long as people have been building things that float, and then trusting those things enough to climb aboard and leave the shore behind. For most of those thousands of years, the crossing was the most dangerous thing a person could do. The ocean was not mapped, the weather was not predicted, and the ships were made of wood and held together with tar and rope, and the accumulated knowledge of builders who understood their craft in the way that any craftsperson understands their craft, which is to say deeply and practically, and without any guarantee that what they built would survive what the water had in mind for it. Most of the time the crossing worked. The ship departed from one place and arrived at another. The cargo was delivered. The passengers disembarked. Nobody thought twice about the water underneath, because the water did what it was supposed to do, which is hold the ship up and let it pass. But sometimes the crossing did not complete. Sometimes a ship left one port and did not arrive at the next. Sometimes the ship itself was found later, empty and drifting, and with no one aboard and no explanation for where the people went. And sometimes, most strangely of all, the ship simply vanished. No wreckage, no distress signal, no debris floating on the surface, no oil slick, no life jackets, nothing. As though the ship and everyone aboard had been subtracted from the world completely, leaving not a single physical trace to confirm that they had ever been there at all. The ocean does this, not maliciously, not with intention. The ocean is a body of water, and what it does, because physics and chemistry and the mechanics of fluid dynamics make certain outcomes more likely than others. But the effect, from the human side of the equation, is indistinguishable from something more deliberate. The ship is here, and then it is not here, and the water where it was looks exactly like the water everywhere else, and there is no mark, no scar, no indication that anything happened at all. The surface heals, the gap closes, and what was lost stays lost in a way that is different from losing something on land, where at least the ground holds still, and the evidence stays where it falls, and someone can come back later, maybe much later, and look. The ocean does not hold still. The ocean is always moving, always rearranging itself, always carrying things away from where they were. A piece of wreckage that surfaces after a sinking can travel hundreds of miles on the current before anyone finds it, and by then it is telling you where the current took it, not where the ship went down. A body in the water is subject to the same forces, the same dispersal, and the same tendency of the ocean to distribute whatever it is given across a volume so vast that finding anything in it, even something the size of a 500-foot ship, can be effectively impossible. Tonight, we are going to spend some time with a few of these stories. Ships that departed and did not arrive. Ships that were found empty with no explanation. Ships that vanished so completely that the only thing left behind was the question of what happened to them. Not as horror stories, although some of them contain moments that are genuinely difficult to sit with. Not as puzzles to be solved, because they will not be solved tonight, and most of them will probably not be solved ever. Just as things that happened on the ocean, things the water took, and things that the silence of the deep has kept for decades or centuries without offering anything resembling an answer. The voice you are hearing right now does not have answers either. That feels important to say at the very start, before any of the stories begin. If you are looking for someone to explain these mysteries, to resolve them into neat conclusions with clear causes and satisfying endings, this is not that. The ocean does not give satisfying endings. It gives circumstances, evidence fragments, and then it gives silence, and the silence is usually the largest part of the story. What follows is an attempt to sit with that silence rather than fill it, to let the stories be what they are, which is strange and incomplete and genuinely unresolved, and in their own way, oddly restful. Because there is something calming about a question that cannot be answered. A solvable problem demands effort. It asks you to think, to work, to strain toward a conclusion. An unsolvable question asks nothing of you. It simply exists, the way the ocean exists, and you can lie beside it in the dark and let it be what it is without needing to do anything about it. That is the kind of company these stories will keep tonight. Quiet company, patient company, the company of things that happened long ago to people who are gone, on water that has moved on, in a world that kept turning and forgot and then remembered and forgot again. The room is still here, your body is still in it, and the weight of you against whatever surface is holding you up is still pressing down with the same quiet insistence that it has been pressing down with since you lay down, since before you started listening, since the moment the day ended and the night began its slow familiar work. The water in the pipes has gone quiet, or it has not, depending on whatever invisible timer governs such things in the place where you live. Let us begin with the most famous one, the one that happened over 150 years ago and has never been explained. Not because the evidence is dramatic. The evidence is not dramatic at all. The evidence is quiet and ordinary and stubbornly free of anything that points in a clear direction. The ship was found floating. The cargo was intact. There was food and water enough to last half a year, and the only thing missing was the people, all 10 of them, gone. On November 7th, 1872, a ship called the Mary Celeste sailed out of New York Harbour into the grey Atlantic. She was a brigantine, which is a type of two-masted sailing vessel that was common in the merchant fleets of the 19th century. Not a large ship, even by the standards of her time. 103 feet long, with a breadth of about 25 feet and a displacement of 282 tons. The kind of vessel that carried cargo across oceans without attracting much attention, without making headlines, without anyone on shore paying much mind to her departure or anticipating her arrival with any particular urgency. She was a working ship. She did a working ship's job. And on that November morning, she left New York carrying a cargo of 1,701 barrels of denatured industrial alcohol, bound for Genoa, Italy. Denatured alcohol is alcohol that has been treated with chemicals to make it unfit for human consumption. It is used in manufacturing, in industrial processes, in the production of things that require a solvent. It is not the kind of cargo that attracts pirates or generates excitement. It is the kind of cargo that gets loaded into a hold, sealed and ignored until the ship reaches its destination and someone with a manifest and a warehouse comes to collect it. There is nothing romantic or dangerous about 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol. It is ordinary commerce. The kind of thing that the global economy runs on and always has, at the slow movement of useful substances from the places where they are produced to the places where they are needed, aboard ships that were built for exactly this purpose. The Mary Celeste had been built for this purpose in 1861 at a shipyard in Spencer's Island. Nova Scotia, a small community on the shores of the Bay of Fundy. She was constructed of locally felled timber, rigged as a brigantine with 2 masts, and originally christened the Amazon. Under that name she had a difficult early career. Her first captain fell ill during the maiden voyage, developed pneumonia, and died. The ship changed hands several times after that. She was damaged in a collision in the English Channel. She ran aground off Cape Breton Island in 1867. The following year, after being sold to an American named Richard Haynes, she was renamed the Mary Celeste, and as if a new name could shake whatever look the old one carried. It did not, as things turned out. But for a few years under the new name, the ship sailed without incident. In early 1872, she underwent a major refit that cost $10,000, a significant sum at the time. Her length was increased, a second deck was added. Many of her original timbers were replaced. She emerged from the shipyard larger, sturdier, and ready for the voyage that would make her the most famous ship in maritime history, though not for any reason her owners would have chosen. Her captain for this voyage was Benjamin Spooner Briggs, 37 years old, from Marin, Massachusetts. This is a detail worth spending a moment with, because the kind of man Briggs was matters to the story. He came from a seafaring family. His father was a ship captain. Benjamin had spent much of his early life aboard ships, learning the trade the way sons of captains did, through observation and practice and the gradual accumulation of the particular kind of knowledge that only comes from years of watching the ocean and learning to read what it is telling you. By 1872, Briggs was married, the father of a 7-year-old son named Arthur and a 2-year-old daughter named Sophia. He was respected in his community. He was known to be competent, careful, and sober. He did not drink alcohol, which is a noteworthy detail when you are captaining a ship loaded with 1,700 one-barrels of the stuff, even if it is the kind you cannot drink. He was, by all surviving accounts, exactly the kind of person you would want in command of a vessel carrying your cargo across the Atlantic. Experienced, steady, reliable. On that November morning 10 people boarded the Mary Celeste. Captain Briggs, his wife Sarah Elizabeth Briggs, who was 31 and who had sailed with her husband before, their daughter Sophia, 2 years old, and 7 crew members whose names are recorded in the ship's papers and who were, like Briggs, professional sailors doing the kind of work that professional sailors did. Their 7-year-old son Arthur was left at home in the care of Briggs's mother. This is the kind of detail that history preserves sometimes, the small domestic arrangement that preceded a departure from which no one returned. 10 people sailed out of New York Harbor on November 7th, 1872. None of them were ever seen again. 8 days later, on November 15th, a British brig called the Dei Gratia left the same harbour, following the same general Atlantic route, bound for Gibraltar. Her captain was David Morehouse, who was acquainted with Briggs. One account, provided by Morehouse's widow, many decades after the fact, claims the 2 captains dined together the evening before the Mary Celeste departed. Whether this is true or simply the kind of detail that memory invents in the aftermath of extraordinary events is impossible to say. What is true is that both ships left New York in November, both sailed east, and their paths were about to converge in a way that neither captain could have anticipated. On December 5th, 1872, roughly 4 weeks after the Mary Celeste's departure and 3 weeks after the Dei Gratia's, the crew of the Dei Gratia spotted a vessel at a position approximately 38 degrees 20 minutes north latitude, 17 degrees 15 minutes west longitude, and this places the ship roughly 400 miles east of the Azores, about halfway between those islands and the coast of Portugal. The vessel was drifting. Her movements were erratic. Her sails were partially set but arranged in an odd configuration, some furled, some not, in a way that suggested no one was controlling them. She was heading in the general direction of the Dei Gratia, but unsteadily, without purpose. Captain Morehouse came on deck. The helmsman pointed out the approaching vessel. Morehouse watched it through his glass. Something was wrong. No one was visible on deck. The ship was not responding to signals. Morehouse ordered a boat lowered and sent his first mate, Oliver DeVoe, and second mate John Wright, across the water to investigate. And what DeVoe and Wright found when they climbed aboard the Mary Celeste has become one of the most discussed scenes in maritime history. And the strange thing about it, the thing that has kept people talking about it for more than 150 years, is that what they found was almost nothing. The ship was not on fire. The hull was not breached. There was no blood on the decks, no bodies in the hold, no signs of struggle or violence. The Mary Celeste was simply empty. The crew's personal belongings were still in their quarters, undisturbed. Trunks and bags sat where they had been placed. Clothing hung where it had been hung. The ship's cargo, 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol stacked in the hold, was largely intact. A later inventory would reveal that 9 of the barrels were empty, but at first glance the cargo appeared undamaged, and the galley contained a 6-month supply of food and water, more than enough for a crew of 10 on a voyage to Italy. The ship's clock was not running. The compass was damaged, the glass broken. The ship's log had been maintained carefully and consistently, with the last entry dated November the 25th, which placed the Mary Celeste near the island of Santa Maria in the Azores. This is worth pausing on. The last log entry was November the 25th. The ship was found on December 5th. That means the Mary Celeste had been drifting, without anyone aboard, for approximately 10 days. 10 days of the ship sailing itself, more or less, carried by the wind in her remaining sails and by the Atlantic currents, covering a distance of several hundred miles in the right general direction toward Europe, and without a single human hand on the wheel or a single human eye on the horizon. The ocean had been steering the Mary Celeste for 10 days, and it had done a credible job. What was missing mattered more than what was present. The ship's only lifeboat was gone. It had been secured on the main hatch and was now absent, along with whatever lines had held it in place. The navigation instruments were gone. The chronometer, the sextant, the tools that a captain would need to determine his position at sea, had been taken. One of the ship's 2 pumps had been disassembled, and its parts lay on the deck as though someone had been in the process of examining or repairing it. There was approximately 3.5 feet of water in the hold, and which sounds alarming but is in fact not especially dangerous, for a ship of the Mary Celeste's size and construction. 3.5 feet of water in the hold is a problem, but it is a manageable problem, the kind of thing that a working pump can address. It is not the kind of problem that forces the immediate abandonment of a seaworthy vessel, and the Mary Celeste was seaworthy. DeVoe and Wright proved this by sailing her. After the initial investigation, Morehouse put a small crew from the De Gratia aboard the Mary Celeste, and they sailed her the remaining 800 miles to Gibraltar, where she arrived without incident. The ship floated. The ship sailed. The ship did everything a ship is supposed to do. The only thing the ship could not do was explain where its people had gone. No distress signal had been sent. In 1872, and there was no radio aboard merchant vessels, but ships in trouble had other means of signalling. Flares, flags, and none of these had been deployed or seen by any vessel in the area. No other ship in the Atlantic reported hearing or seeing anything unusual in the vicinity of the Mary Celeste's last known position. The weather in the Azores region around November 25th had been rough, with strong winds and heavy seas, but not catastrophic. The Mary Celeste had weathered storms before. She was built for the Atlantic. She had been crossing it for over a decade. In Gibraltar, a British Vice Admiralty court convened what was officially a salvage hearing. These hearings were routine in maritime law. When one ship rescues another ship, the rescuers are entitled to compensation from the rescued ship's insurers, and the hearing determines how much. It should have been straightforward. But the Attorney General of Gibraltar, a man named Frederick Solly Flood, looked at the circumstances of the Mary Celeste and suspected something darker than a routine abandonment. Solly Flood ordered the ship inspected in detail. Stains were found on the hull, on a railing, and on a sword that belonged to Captain Briggs. Were they blood? Solly Flood had them analysed. They were not blood. The stains on the sword appeared to have been caused by ordinary wear and environmental exposure. The marks on the hull were consistent with normal use. There was no physical evidence that any violence had occurred aboard the ship. Solly Flood then turned his attention to the crew of the Dei Grazia. Had they murdered the Mary Celeste's occupants and staged the abandonment to collect the salvage reward? And the theory was investigated. No evidence supported it. The timeline did not work. The geography did not work. The Dei Grazia had left New York 8 days after the Mary Celeste on a slower vessel. The idea that Morehouse's crew had somehow overtaken the Mary Celeste, boarded her, murdered 10 people including a woman and a 2-year-old child, disposed of all the bodies and all the evidence, staged the scene to look like a voluntary abandonment, and then sailed on as though nothing had happened, was difficult to sustain against the physical evidence which pointed to no foul play of any kind. Solly Flood considered mutiny. Had the crew of the Mary Celeste risen against Captain Briggs, killed him and his family, and then fled in the lifeboat? There was no evidence for this either. Briggs was widely respected, his crew was experienced and so far as anyone knew, content. The cargo of denatured alcohol was undrinkable, so the theory that the crew got into the cargo and turned violent did not hold. The personal belongings left aboard suggested that whoever departed the ship did so quickly, without packing, which is not consistent with a planned mutiny. The hearing lasted 3 months. At the end of it, the court found no evidence of foul play. But the salvage award given to the Dei Grazia crew was remarkably small. They received roughly 1/6 of what the ship and its cargo had been insured for. This was far less than the standard salvage payout, and it suggests that the court, while unable to prove any wrongdoing, was not entirely satisfied with the explanation either. There was suspicion in the air, a feeling that something was not right, but the evidence refused to organise itself into a coherent narrative, and without a narrative, there could be no verdict. Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their daughter Sophia, and the 7 crew members of the Mary Celeste were never found. No bodies washed ashore anywhere in the Atlantic. No lifeboat was recovered on any coastline. No message in a bottle, no scrap of clothing, no piece of wreckage identifiable as belonging to the ship's complement of people has ever been discovered. The 10 people who boarded the Mary Celeste in New York on November 7th, 1872, vanished from the surface of the earth as completely as if they had never existed, and the earth, which is not sentimental about such things, went on turning without them. The silence is complete, and it has been complete for over 150 years. In whatever happened aboard the Mary Celeste between November 25th, when the last log entry was recorded, and some unspecified moment in the days that followed, when the last person left the ship, happened in a total privacy. The ocean was the only witness, and the ocean does not testify. But people cannot leave a silence like that alone. The human mind, confronted with a void where an explanation should be, will fill it. This is not a flaw. It is how we are built. The absence of answers produces theories the way a wound produces scar tissue, layer after layer, each one an attempt to close the gap and make the surface smooth again. The Mary Celeste has generated more theories per square foot of deck space than perhaps any vessel in maritime history. Some of them are absurd. Giant squid, alien abduction, Bermuda Triangle forces, and despite the fact that the ship was found nowhere near the Bermuda Triangle, some of them are well-intentioned but unsupported. Piracy, though nothing valuable was taken. Waterspout, though no ships in the area reported one. Sea monster, which does not warrant further discussion. And then there are the theories that deserve more careful attention, because they are built on actual evidence and proposed by people who have spent years studying the case. The most thorough of these investigations was conducted by a documentary filmmaker named Anne McGregor, who produced a film called The True Story of the Mary Celeste with funding from Smithsonian Networks. McGregor travelled to Captain Briggs's hometown of Marion, Massachusetts. She interviewed descendants of the crew. She consulted with Phil Richardson, a physical oceanographer at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts, who specializes in the behavior of derelict vessels and the effects of currents on uncrewed ships. What McGregor's investigation proposed was this: of the 1,701 barrels of alcohol in the Mary Celeste's hold, 9 were found to be empty when the ship was inventoried in Gibraltar. These 9 barrels were made of red oak. The remaining barrels were made of white oak. Red oak is more porous than white oak. It allows vapour to pass through its grain more readily. If the 9 red oak barrels had developed leaks, whether through the stress of the voyage or through some defect in their construction, the alcohol inside would have evaporated into the hold, producing a build-up of fumes in the enclosed space below decks. Alcohol vapour is heavier than air. It accumulates at low points. In a ship's hold, which is essentially a sealed container being rocked back and forth by the motion of the sea, the vapour would have concentrated near the bottom and gradually filled the space. It is colourless, but it has a strong, recognisable smell, and any sailor who opened the hatch and caught a noseful of alcohol fumes in a confined space would have had good reason to be alarmed. McGregor's theory suggests that what may have happened is this: at some point after November 25th, someone opened the forward hatch, perhaps to inspect the cargo, perhaps because someone smelled something wrong, and was met with a rush of alcohol vapour. In the worst-case scenario, this vapour could have ignited, producing a sudden explosive flash, not a structural explosion, not the kind of detonation that tears a ship apart, but a flash of ignited vapour that fills a space with heat and noise, and a burst of flame that burns off quickly because there is no sustained fuel source. The kind of event that is terrifying to experience, but leaves little physical damage afterward. If you are Captain Briggs standing on the deck of your ship with your wife and your 2-year-old daughter, and the hatch just belched a fireball, what do? You might do exactly what the evidence suggests someone did. You evacuate. You put everyone into the lifeboat. You take the navigation instruments because you are a professional sailor and you know that a lifeboat in the open Atlantic without a sextant is a death sentence. You take the chronometer. You leave the personal belongings because there is no time. And you lower the lifeboat and you get everyone off the ship as quickly as you can. But you do not sail away. You are not abandoning the ship permanently. You are a captain, and the ship is your responsibility, and the cargo is someone else's property, and you intend to go back aboard as soon as the danger has passed. So you rig a line between the lifeboat and the Mary Celeste, a tow rope or a painter, something that keeps the lifeboats connected to the ship so that you can pull yourself back once the fumes have vented and the danger has cleared. And then the line breaks, or it was not secured properly, or the wind catches the Mary Celeste's remaining sails, the ones that were still set when the Dei Gratita found her, and the ship begins to move faster than the lifeboat can follow. The gap widens. 100 yards becomes 200, and 200 becomes a quarter mile. The Mary Celeste, with no one aboard, is being driven by the wind across the surface of the Atlantic, and 10 people in a small open boat are watching it go. And the distance is increasing, and there is nothing they can do about it. A lifeboat in the open Atlantic in late November, with 10 people aboard, including a 2-year-old child, without shelter, without provisions beyond whatever was grabbed in the rush to evacuate, is not a survivable situation for very long. The North Atlantic in November is cold. The seas are rough. A small boat can be swamped by waves that a larger vessel would ride over without difficulty. If the line to the Mary Celeste broke, and if the ship sailed away under its own remnant sails, if then 10 people were left in the open ocean with no realistic means of rescue and no way to reach land. The Azores were the nearest islands, but even the Azores were far enough away that reaching them in an open boat, in heavy weather, without navigation instruments, would have required extraordinary luck. This theory is not proven. It cannot be proven. Every piece of evidence it relies on is circumstantial. The 9 empty barrels were real. The red oak composition of those barrels is documented. The disassembled pump is consistent with someone investigating a water or fume problem below decks. The missing lifeboat and navigation instruments are consistent with a deliberate, rapid evacuation. The fact that personal belongings were left behind is consistent with urgency, but none of this constitutes proof. It is a story that fits the available facts, which is different from a story that is confirmed by the available facts. The difference matters, and it is worth sitting with because it is the difference between an answer and a theory, and the Mary Celeste, after all these years, still only has theories. There is another detail from McGregor's investigation that deserves mention because it addresses one of the stranger aspects of the evidence. The disassembled pump, the one whose parts were found on deck, suggests that someone was trying to determine how much water was actually in the hold. The Mary Celeste had recently undergone its major refit, and it was also carrying coal on this voyage. Coal dust and construction debris from the renovation could have clogged the pumps, and which would have made it difficult for the crew to get an accurate reading of the water level. If Briggs could not pump the hold effectively, and if the sounding rod, the instrument used to measure water depth in the hold, was giving readings that seemed alarming, he might have concluded that the ship was taking on water more rapidly than it actually was. In other words, the ship might have seemed to be in worse shape than it was, and the decision to evacuate might have been based on incomplete information. This is the kind of detail that makes the Mary Celeste story so difficult to let go of. Not the drama of it, because there is remarkably little drama in the physical evidence, but the quiet tragedy of a possible mistake. A good captain, experienced and careful, making the best decision he could with the information he had, and getting it wrong. Loading his family into a lifeboat because he believed his ship was going down, and then watching the ship sail away without them. Still floating, still seaworthy, carrying everything they needed to survive, while they sat in an open boat on the North Atlantic in late November with nothing. If that is what happened, it is not a mystery, so much as a catastrophe. A perfectly human catastrophe. The kind of thing that happens when the margin between safety and disaster is thin, and the information you need to make the right call arrives a few minutes too late, or not at all. Here is what happened to the ship after the hearing. The Mary Celeste, despite being the most famous ghost ship in history, went back to work. She was sold and resold over the next 12 years, changing hands multiple times, and sailing under different captains, carrying different cargoes to different ports. She was not popular with sailors, who are a superstitious profession and who tend to avoid vessels with reputations. But she was a functional ship, and someone always needed cargo moved, and so she sailed. In 1884, 2 years after the hearing, Arthur Conan Doyle published a short story called J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement, which was based loosely on the Mary Celeste story, but which took enormous liberties with the facts, including misspelling the ship's name as Marie Celeste. Doyle's story featured a fictional survivor and an entirely invented explanation involving a conspiracy. It was published in a respected literary magazine and was taken by some readers as a factual account, which caused considerable confusion and annoyed the people who had actually been involved in the case. The misspelling, Marie instead of Mary, became more common in popular usage than the ship's real name, which is a small indignity but a lasting one. In 1885, the Mary Celeste's final captain, a man named Gilman C. Parker, deliberately sailed her onto the Rocheleau Reef off the coast of Haiti. He had over-insured the cargo and intended to collect. The ship, which had survived the whatever happened in the Atlantic 13 years earlier, which had sailed on for over a decade, carrying the weight of its own legend without complaint, came to rest on a Caribbean reef because someone decided it was worth more destroyed than floating. Parker was indicted for fraud, but he died before he could stand trial. The Mary Celeste was left on the reef, and where she slowly deteriorated over the years and decades that followed. In 2001, an expedition led by Clive Cussler, the adventure novelist who also ran a marine archaeology organisation called Numa, announced that they had found what they believed to be the remains of the Mary Celeste on the Rocheleau Reef. Initial tests on the recovered wood suggested it was the right type for an 1872 New York shipyard refit, but subsequent analysis, specifically dendrochronological testing conducted by the Geological Survey of Canada, determined that the wood came from trees that were still growing in 1894, which was roughly a decade after the Mary Celeste met its end. The wreck Cussler found was not the Mary Celeste. As of today, the physical remains of the ship have never been positively identified, and this is the kind of ending that the Mary Celeste specialises in. Not an ending at all, not a resolution, just another layer of silence laid on top of the silence that was already there. The ship vanished into the reef, the same way its crew vanished into the Atlantic, and the physical evidence that might have confirmed something, anything, about what happened, is gone. The room is still here, if you are still in it. Your body is still pressing into whatever surface is holding you. There is a particular kind of weight that the body acquires when it has been lying still for a while, a heaviness in the shoulders and the hips that is not unpleasant, that is in fact the beginning of what sleep feels like when it approaches from a distance. Not sudden, not dramatic, just a gradual increase in the gravity of rest, and the body getting heavier in a way that means it is starting to let go. The Mary Celeste left New York with 10 people aboard. None of them came back. The ship came back in a sense, salvaged and sailed and worked for another dozen years before being deliberately destroyed by a man committing insurance fraud on a Caribbean reef. The people did not come back. The Atlantic kept them. Somewhere off the Azores, in water that is now 150 years older than it was when the Mary Celeste passed through it, the currents are still moving, still carrying, still rearranging whatever the ocean holds in that region of the world. If a lifeboat went down there, if 10 people entered the water in late November of 1872 and did not survive, then whatever physical evidence that the event produced has long since been dispersed across the ocean floor, absorbed into the sediment, incorporated into the geology of the seabed, indistinguishable from everything else the Atlantic has taken and kept over the millennia. The next story is different. Not a ghost ship, not a vessel found empty and drifting. The next one is a ship that was never found at all, a ship that left port and simply ceased to exist, taking with it over 200 people, leaving behind nothing except the absence of a ship where a ship should have been. And the strangest detail of this next story is not the disappearance itself, but the fact that someone knew it was going to happen. Someone got off the ship the day before it sailed. Someone chose land over water, safety over passage based on a feeling they could not explain, and would spend the rest of their life being grateful for. That ship left Durban, South Africa, on the evening of July 26, 1909. It was called the Waratah. The Waratah is a flower, a deep red wildflower native to Australia, the floral emblem of New South Wales, with thick fleshy petals that curl inward toward a dense central cluster. It is the kind of flower that looks, to someone encountering it for the first time, both beautiful and slightly unsettling, as though nature had designed it to be admired from a respectful distance. The ship that bore its name was built to be admired as well, a new passenger and cargo steamship constructed in 1908 at the Barclay-Curleigh shipyard in Glasgow, Scotland, for the Blue Anchor Line, a shipping company that operated routes between Europe and Australia. She was roughly 500 feet long, displaced over 9,000 gross tons, and was fitted with accommodations for passengers as well as holds for cargo. She was, by the standards of her day, a fine ship, modern, well built, the pride of a fleet that depended on her to carry people and goods safely across the Indian Ocean and back. She was also, according to at least one person who sailed on her, deeply wrong. Not in any way that the builders or the owners acknowledged, and not in any way that a casual observer would have noticed, but wrong in the way she moved in the water, wrong in the way she responded to the ocean's moods, wrong in a way that made a man named Claude Sawyer decide, when the ship reached Durban, South Africa, on her second voyage, that he was getting off and not getting back on. no matter what it cost him in inconvenience or embarrassment, or the price of a new ticket on a different ship. Sawyer was a passenger, not a sailor. He was a businessman, travelling from Australia back toward England. He had boarded the Waratah in Adelaide, and had endured the voyage across the Indian Ocean with a growing sense that something about the ship's behaviour was not right. "She rolled too heavily," he said later, during the official inquiry into the ship's disappearance. "She recovered from her rolls too slowly. There was a sluggishness in her movements that suggested she was not as stable as a ship of her size and design ought to be." He described a recurring nightmare he experienced while aboard, a dream in which a figure appeared to him holding a bloody sword. And while the dream itself is the kind of detail that belongs more to folklore than to naval architecture, the instinct behind it, the visceral feeling that this ship is not safe, is something that sailors and passengers have reported for as long as ships have sailed. Sawyer disembarked at Durban. He told people why. He said the ship was going to sink. He could not explain how he knew this, and the explanation he offered, a dream about a man with a bloody sword, did not carry much weight with anyone who heard it. He sounded like a nervous traveller. He sounded like someone who had let the stress of a long voyage get the better of him. He sounded, in other words, like exactly the kind of person whose warnings get politely ignored. The Waratah left Durban on the evening of July 26, 1909, bound for Cape Town, carrying 211 passengers and crew. She was under the command of Captain Joshua Edward Ilbery, 69 years old, the Blue Anchor Line's most experienced officer. Captain Ilbery had been at sea for decades, and he had participated in the rescue of passengers from other ships. He was the kind of captain that a shipping company assigns to its newest and most prestigious vessel, because his presence aboard is a statement of confidence in the ship and in the voyage. The cargo in the Waratah's holds on this voyage included approximately 1,000 tons of lead and 300 tons of lead ore concentrate, loaded in Adelaide, along with refrigerated meat and other provisions. The lead ore concentrate is a detail that would become significant much later, after the ship had been gone long enough for people to start looking for explanations. Lead ore concentrate, under certain conditions, can liquefy. The constant motion of a ship at sea can cause the granular material to behave like a fluid, shifting en masse from one side of the hold to the other as the ship rolls. And this is called the free surface effect, and it is extremely dangerous, because a cargo that shifts suddenly and dramatically can change the ship's centre of gravity in an instant, causing it to heel over past the point of recovery. Today, ore concentrate is classified as hazardous cargo, with specific regulations governing how it must be loaded and transported. In 1909, no such regulations existed. The dangers of carrying this kind of material in bulk were not well understood, and the Waratah loaded it the way it loaded everything else, as cargo without special precautions. The ship left Durban in the evening and steamed south along the coast of what was then the colony of Natal, heading for Cape Town. What happened next is known only through the accounts of other ships that were in the area, and those accounts are fragmentary, uncertain, and in some cases contradictory. The last confirmed sighting of the Waratah occurred in the early morning hours of July 27th, when the steamer Clan McIntyre, travelling in the opposite direction, spotted a large vessel and exchanged lamp signals. This was standard practice. Ships passing in the night would flash their names and destinations to one another using signal lamps, the maritime equivalent of a nod between strangers on a dark road. The Clan McIntyre identified the other ship as being near the mouth of the Embash River, off the coast of what is now the Eastern Cape of South Africa. The weather was deteriorating. A storm was building over the region. The two ships signalled each other and continued on their respective courses. After that there are only unconfirmed sightings, each of them troubling in its own way, in each of them painting a slightly different picture of what might have been happening aboard the Waratah in those final hours. The captain of the steamer Harlow reported seeing a vessel producing an excessive amount of smoke at a distance. This was unusual. A new ship like the Waratah should not have been belching smoke unless something was wrong, unless something was burning that should not have been burning, or unless the engines were being pushed in ways they were not designed for. When darkness fell, the Harlow crew watched the running lights of the steamer approaching their position, and then suddenly they saw two bright flashes coming from the direction of the other ship. The lights disappeared. The captain of the Harlow believed the flashes were explosions. Later that same evening, around 9:30 at night, the Union Castle liner Guelph, travelling northward toward Durban, passed a ship and exchanged lamp signals. The weather and visibility were poor. The Guelph was only able to make out the last three letters of the other ship's name. The letters were T, A, H, the ending of the word Waratah. The Guelph did not report the ship as being in distress. No distress signals were flown. Whatever condition the Waratah was in at that point, she was apparently still underway, still moving, still communicating with passing vessels in the normal way. And then there is the account of Edward Joe Conker, a mounted rifleman in the Cape Mounted Rifles, who was stationed with another signaller named Adshead at the mouth of the Chora River on July 27th for military exercises. Conker was watching the sea through a telescope. He recorded in his diary that he observed a ship whose description matched that of the Waratah struggling against heavy seas, making slow progress in a southwesterly direction. He watched the ship roll heavily to starboard, and then before it could right itself, a following wave rolled over the ship, and when Conker looked for it again, it was gone. He believed he had watched the Waratah go down. Conker reported what he saw to his superiors. His superiors did not take the matter seriously, apparently because Conker was not a naval officer, and his telescope observation was considered insufficient evidence. Conker did not come forward with his account publicly until 1929, 20 years after the event. The Waratah was expected in Cape Town on July 29th. She did not arrive. Initially there was no alarm. Ships were often late. Delays of days or even weeks were not uncommon in 1909, and the Waratah was widely considered to be a strong modern vessel, not the kind of ship that people worried about. But as other ships that had departed Durban after the Waratah began arriving in Cape Town, and as each of them reported not having seen the Waratah on the route, anxiety began to build. Search efforts were organised. The Blue Anchor Line dispatched ships to search the waters along the Waratah's expected route. The Union Castle cargo ship Sabine was sent out with searchlights and detection equipment. The Waratah's own sister ship, the Geelong, diverted from its regular course to search waters east of Natal. Other vessels in the area joined the effort. For months, ships crisscrossed the Indian Ocean off the South African coast, looking for some sign of the Waratah, and any sign, a piece of wreckage, a lifeboat, a body, a barrel, anything that would confirm that the ship had sunk and indicate where. They found nothing. Not a single piece of debris was ever conclusively identified as belonging to the Waratah. There were reports of bodies in the water near the mouth of the Embash River, sighted by the steamer in Sidswa on August 13th, more than 2 weeks after the disappearance. The captain of the Tottenham also reported seeing what might have been bodies, but nothing was recovered. Nothing was confirmed. On August 14th, a false report circulated that the Waratah had been sighted, making slowly toward Durban under her own power, in Adelaide, Australia, where many of the passengers had boarded and where their families waited. The town bells were rung in celebration. The celebration was premature, and the ship that had been sighted was not the Waratah. The bells had rung for nothing. The families went home and continued waiting. A court of inquiry was convened in London. It sat for 14 months, hearing testimony from witnesses, from passengers who had sailed on the Waratah's maiden voyage and noticed her tendency to roll heavily, from engineers and naval architects who debated her stability and design. The inquiry could not determine what had happened. The ship had simply disappeared. Arthur Conan Doyle, who by this point in his life had developed a serious interest in spiritualism, reportedly conducted a séance to attempt to contact the spirits of the passengers. Whatever the spirits had to say, it did not contribute to the official record, and the leading modern theory is that the Waratah was caught in a severe storm off the coast of the Eastern Cape and capsized, possibly due to a combination of heavy seas and the shifting of her cargo of lead ore concentrate. The two bright flashes seen by the Harlow may have been boiler explosions as seawater entered the engine room of a ship that was already listing beyond recovery. The sighting by Conker, the rifleman with the telescope, may have been the final moments of the Waratah as she was overwhelmed by a following sea and went under. There is another possibility that has gained attention in the years since the disappearance, and that is the rogue wave. Rogue waves are enormous, isolated waves that can reach heights far exceeding the average wave height in a given sea state. For most of maritime history, the rogue waves were dismissed by scientists as sailors' tales, exaggerations born of fear and bad visibility, and the natural human tendency to make a story more dramatic in the telling. This changed in 1995, when a wave measuring 25.6 meters, approximately 84 feet, was recorded by instruments on the Draupner oil platform in the North Sea, providing the first scientific measurement of a wave that had previously been considered impossible by prevailing oceanographic models. Rogue waves are now a recognised phenomenon, and the waters off the southeast coast of South Africa, where the warm Agulhas current meets colder Antarctic waters, are known to be particularly prone to their formation. A rogue wave of sufficient size, striking a ship that was already compromised by heavy seas and possibly shifting cargo. He could have sunk the Waratah in minutes, without time for a distress signal, without time for anything except the water closing over the hull. The wreck of the Waratah has never been conclusively found. Marine explorer Emlyn Brown spent 18 years searching for it, and in 1999 announced that he had located a wreck off the Eastern Cape coast, matching the Waratah's profile. But when an expedition funded by Clive Cussler's Nume organisation sent a submarine to the site, the wreck turned out to be a cargo ship carrying military hardware, tanks, tyres and trucks, sunk by a German U-boat in 1942. Not the Waratah, not even close. The Waratah remains with the ocean put her, wherever that is, keeping her own counsel. 211 people left Durban on the evening of July 26, 1909. Claude Sawyer, the man who got off because of a dream about a bloody sword, spent the rest of his life knowing that he had been right, and that the explanation he had given for his decision, a dream, was the kind of explanation that no rational person would accept, and yet it had saved his life, and nothing more rational had saved the lives of the 211 who stayed aboard. The weight of the body shifts again, slightly. A small adjustment, almost unconscious, the kind of repositioning that the muscles perform without consulting the mind, finding a new angle of rest, a new distribution of pressure against the surface beneath you. The stories are doing their work, or the night is doing its work, or perhaps both are doing the same work from different directions, which is to carry you slowly toward the place where the thinking stops and the body takes over and the day, with all its noise and motion, finally lets go. And the next ship left from the other side of the Atlantic. She was an American naval vessel, the largest collier in the United States Navy, carrying a wartime cargo of manganese ore from Brazil to Baltimore. She was 542 feet long and displaced nearly 20,000 tons, and she was crewed by over 300 men, and she disappeared somewhere between Barbados and the Virginia Capes in March of 1918, during the last year of the First World War, and the United States Navy has never been able to explain what happened to her. Her name was the Cyclops, and the Secretary of the Navy at the time called her "lost the most baffling mystery in the annals of the service." The USS Cyclops was named after the one-eyed giants of Greek mythology. She was a Proteus-class collier, which means she was built to carry coal, dubbed the fuel that powered the warships of the early 20th century. If that sounds unglamorous, it is because it was. A collier is the maritime equivalent of a fuel truck. She does not fight. She does not explore. She pulls alongside larger, more important vessels, and she gives them what they need to keep going. And then she goes somewhere to fill up again and comes back and does it over. The work is grueling and repetitive and essential, and nobody writes songs about it. The Cyclops was built by William Cramp and Sons in Philadelphia, one of the premier shipyards in the United States, and she was launched in 1910. She was large for a collier, 542 feet long, roughly 65 feet across the beam, with a displacement of nearly 20,000 tons when fully loaded. Her cargo capacity was enormous. She could carry over 12,500 tons of coal in her holds, enough to refuel a fleet of warships and keep them operational for weeks. At the time of her commissioning, she was described by the trade journal International Marine Engineering as the largest naval collier in the world. For the first 7 years of her life, the Cyclops did what colliers do. She carried coal to the ships of the United States Navy, up and down the eastern seaboard, through the Caribbean, across the Atlantic to France, when the United States entered the First World War in 1917. She was not a combat vessel, but she was essential to the war effort, because the warships could not fight if they could not steam, and they could not steam without fuel. In June 1917, the Cyclops was part of the convoy escort for the 1st American Expeditionary Force, sailing to Saint-Nazaire, France. She carried not only fuel and supplies, but also members of the staff of Army Base Hospital No. 18, the first hospital unit to arrive in France. Then she came back across the Atlantic and resumed her coal runs along the coast. Her commanding officer was a man named George W. Worley, and this is a character who deserves some attention, because his story is unusual even by the standards of 1918. Worley held the rank of Lieutenant Commander in the Naval Reserve Force. He was not a career Navy man. He was a merchant mariner who had been called into naval service when the war began. He was gruff. He was eccentric. He carried a cane and wore it like an affectation, which earned him the nickname Dutch and the wary attention of his crew. He was known for berating his officers and crew, for making erratic command decisions, and for running a ship that at least one account describes as having a toxic command climate. What makes Worley's story stranger still is his past. His birth name was not George Worley. It was Johann Friedrich Wichmann. He was German-born, and he had arrived in the United States by jumping ship off the coast of San Francisco in 1878. He assumed the identity of a friend and lived under the name George Worley for the rest of his life. This means that during the First World War, a German-born man commanding an American naval vessel under a false name was entrusted with carrying strategic war cargo across the Atlantic. The Navy either did not know about his background or did not consider it disqualifying. Either way, it would become one of the many threads of speculation that followed the ship's disappearance. In January 1918, the Cyclops was ordered to Brazil. Not to carry coal this time, but to pick up a different cargo for the return trip. The United States, now fully engaged in the war in Europe, needed manganese, a metallic element used in the production of steel, which was in turn needed for weapons, vehicles, ships, and virtually everything else the war effort consumed. Brazil had manganese. The Navy wanted it in Baltimore. The Cyclops departed Norfolk, Virginia, on January 8, 1918, loaded with coal, mail, and supplies for the South American Patrol Squadron. The weather was cold. The harbour was frozen. A light snow was falling. In the ship channel, the Cyclops narrowly avoided a collision with another vessel, the USS Survey, which was outbound for the Mediterranean. And this was the first of what a survivor from an earlier port of call would later describe as a series of untoward incidents that dogged the ship on her final voyage. The crossing to Brazil was uneventful by wartime standards. The Cyclops arrived at Rio de Janeiro and then moved on to Salvador, in the Brazilian state of Bahia, where she took on her return cargo, approximately 10,800 long tons of manganese ore. This is an enormous amount of cargo. The Cyclops was designed to carry coal, and coal is heavy, but manganese ore is denser than coal. The ship was loaded to capacity, and possibly beyond it. The exact weight has been debated by historians, with some accounts suggesting the ship may have been overloaded relative to her rated capacity for this type of cargo. During the loading in Brazil, the Cyclops developed a mechanical problem. Her starboard engine failed. The nature of the failure is not entirely clear from surviving records, but it was serious enough that the engine could not be repaired in Brazil. Captain Worley determined that the ship could make the voyage home on her port engine alone at a reduced speed of roughly 10 knots, about 2/3 of her normal top speed. The repairs would be completed in Baltimore. A man named Conrad Nerwig was a crew member aboard the Cyclops during the outbound voyage to Brazil. When the ship reached Rio de Janeiro, Nerwig received orders transferring him to a different assignment. He left the ship. Captain Worley attempted to have the transfer orders revoked, apparently because he liked Nerwig, but he was unsuccessful. Nerwig stepped off the Cyclops in Rio and watched her sail away, and he would later become one of the few people who served aboard the ship during her final voyage sequence, and survived to tell about it, simply because the Navy's paperwork moved him to a different ship before the Cyclops began her fatal return. The Cyclops departed Salvador on February 21st, 1918, heading north. Her first and only scheduled stop on the way home was Bahia, where she arrived briefly, took on mail from the naval vessels at anchor, and departed at 6 in the evening bound for Baltimore. From this point forward, the Cyclops had no scheduled stops between Brazil and the Chesapeake Bay, but she made one. On March 3rd and 4th, 1918, the Cyclops appeared at Bridgetown, Barbados, an unscheduled stop that has never been fully explained. Why did Worley divert to Barbados? The ship was running on one engine. Perhaps the port engine was also showing signs of trouble and Worley wanted to put in somewhere before attempting the long open ocean crossing to Virginia. Perhaps the ship needed supplies or provisions. Perhaps Worley, known for erratic decisions, simply decided on his own authority to stop. The records do not say. What the records do say is that the Cyclops was in Barbados on those dates, that she took on some supplies, and that she departed on the afternoon of March 4th, 1918. The last communication from the Cyclops was a brief message transmitted around the time of her departure from Barbados. The content of this message, according to some accounts, was simply, "Weather fair, all well." 4 words, routine. The kind of thing a ship says when there's nothing to report and no reason to expect that anything needs reporting. Weather fair, and all well. The last 4 words anyone would ever receive from a ship carrying over 300 people. The Cyclops was expected in Baltimore on or around March 13th. She did not arrive. She did not arrive the next day, or the day after that, or the day after that. No distress signal was received. No ship in the area reported seeing the Cyclops after she left Barbados. No wreckage was found floating in her expected path. No oil slick, no debris, no bodies. The Cyclops, all 542 feet and 19,000 tons of her, carrying over 300 crew and passengers and nearly 11,000 tons of manganese ore, had vanished from the surface of the Atlantic Ocean without leaving a single trace. The Navy launched a search. Multiple ships were dispatched to retrace the Cyclops' expected route from Barbados to Virginia. They found nothing, and French and American vessels searched the trade routes between the Caribbean and the east coast of the United States. They found nothing. For weeks, and then months, ships crisscrossed the waters where the Cyclops should have been, and the ocean gave them nothing back. Not a plank, not a life jacket, not a barrel of manganese ore, nothing at all. On June 1st, 1918, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a man named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who would later become the 32nd President of the United States, officially declared the Cyclops lost and all hands deceased. The Navy listed the dead at 306 people. Other accounts put the number at 309, depending on how certain passengers and last-minute additions to the crew are counted. Either way, and it was the largest non-combat loss of life in the history of the United States Navy involving a steel vessel. It remains so today. In his annual report for 1918, the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, wrote a sentence that has been quoted in nearly every account of the Cyclops published since. He wrote, "There has been no more baffling mystery in the annals of the Navy than the disappearance last March of the USS Cyclops. That assessment was accurate in 1918, and it is still accurate today. The Navy has never determined what happened to the ship. The wreck has never been found. The theories, when they came from every direction. The first and most obvious, given that the world was at war, was that the Cyclops had been sunk by a German submarine. The German U-boats were active in the Caribbean and along the Atlantic shipping lanes in 1918, and the Cyclops was carrying a cargo of strategic military value. Manganese ore was essential for steel production, and sinking a ship carrying 11,000 tons of it would have been a meaningful act of war. The theory was investigated. After the armistice in November 1918, and in the years that followed, German naval records were examined. The German Navy denied any involvement with the Cyclops, both during the war and after it. No U-boat commander reported attacking, or even sighting, a ship matching the Cyclops' description in the relevant waters during the relevant time frame. The theory was not conclusively disproven, because the absence of a German record does not guarantee the absence of a German torpedo, but it was considered increasingly unlikely as the evidence accumulated. There was the sabotage theory. Captain Worley was German-born, operating under a false identity, commanding an American warship during a war against Germany. Could he have deliberately sunk his own ship? Could he have arranged for the Cyclops to be turned over to a German naval force? The idea was investigated. There is no evidence to support it. The ship carried over 300 people, most of them American sailors, and the notion that Worley could have engineered the destruction of his own vessel, with himself aboard, as an act of espionage, does not hold up well under scrutiny. Sabotage by another crew member, someone acting on behalf of Germany, was also considered. No evidence for this either. There was the mutiny theory. Worley was unpopular. His command style was abrasive. He berated his officers. He made decisions that his subordinates considered irrational. The navigation on the outbound voyage to Brazil had been poor, with the ship arriving at its destinations from wrong directions, as though the person determining the course was either incompetent or indifferent. Could the crew have risen against Worley? Could a mutiny aboard a ship carrying 300 people have spiraled out of control, resulting in the loss of the vessel? It is possible in theory, but there is no evidence for it, and the complete absence of any wreckage or survivors makes it difficult to construct a scenario in which a mutiny leads to the total disappearance of a ship without any physical trace. The most widely accepted theory among modern historians and naval analysts is structural failure, and this theory rests on several facts that are well documented. The Cyclops was designed to carry coal. She was carrying manganese ore, which is significantly denser than coal. The weight distribution in her holds may have been different from what the ship's structure was designed to handle. The ship was running on one engine, which affected her ability to maintain course and heading in heavy weather, and most significantly, two of the Cyclops' sister ships, the Proteus and the Nereus, both built to the same Proteus-class design, also vanished at sea during the Second World War, less than a year apart, while carrying cargoes of metallic ore similar to the Cyclops' fatal load of manganese. Rear Admiral George Van Deurs, writing about the loss of the Cyclops, he noted that the I-beams running the length of the Proteus-class ships had been observed to erode due to the corrosive nature of certain cargoes. This corrosion had been documented on the USS Jason, another ship of the same class, and was believed to have contributed to the loss of a similar freighter that broke in two in calm seas. If the Cyclops' structural members had been weakened by years of carrying corrosive materials, and if the ship was then loaded with a cargo that was heavier than coal, and that placed different stresses on those weakened members, The ship could have suffered a catastrophic structural failure, breaking apart so quickly that there was no time to send a distress signal and no opportunity for the crew to deploy life rafts. Rear Admiral David W. Taylor, who served as Chief of the Bureau of Construction and Repair, offered a related assessment. He stated that the loss of the Cyclops was likely the result of a combination of unfavourable weather and sea conditions combined with a cargo of manganese that may have been prone to shifting. Cargo shifting is the same phenomenon that was discussed in connection with the Waratah, the lead ore concentrate that could liquefy and move suddenly from one side of the hold to the other. Manganese ore can behave similarly under certain conditions, and a sudden shift of 11,000 tons of material to one side of a ship already compromised by engine trouble and structural weakness could have capsized the Cyclops in moments. This is the theory that makes the most mechanical sense. It accounts for the speed of the disappearance, the absence of a distress signal, and the fact that the Cyclops' sister ships met similar fates. It does not account for the total absence of wreckage, which is unusual even for a ship that sinks quickly, since normally some debris, some floatable material, breaks free during a sinking and surfaces afterward. But the Cyclops was carrying 11,000 tons of metal ore, which means she would have sunk fast and gone deep, and the Atlantic current in the area between Barbados and Virginia is strong enough to disperse floating debris across a wide area in a relatively short time. If the search ships were looking in the wrong place, even by a few dozen miles, they could have missed the debris field entirely. There is one more aspect of this story that is worth noting, not because it explains anything, but because it adds a particular quality of strangeness that the story seems to demand. The Cyclops disappeared in the general vicinity of what would later become known as the Bermuda Triangle, that loosely defined region of the Western Atlantic, bounded roughly by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, within which a supposedly disproportionate number of ships and aircraft have disappeared over the years. The Cyclops is often cited as one of the most significant Bermuda Triangle cases, and her disappearance has been attributed, in various popular accounts, to everything from magnetic anomalies to methane gas eruptions to underwater alien bases. It is worth noting that the Bermuda Triangle, as a concept, does not have the support of the scientific community or the major maritime insurance industry. Lloyd's of London, and which has insured ships for centuries and which tracks losses with meticulous precision, because their business depends on it, has stated that the Bermuda Triangle does not have a statistically higher rate of maritime losses than any other comparable region of ocean with similar traffic volumes. The United States Coast Guard has reached the same conclusion. Ships disappear in the Bermuda Triangle at roughly the same rate they disappear everywhere else, which is to say rarely, but not never, and when they do disappear, the causes are generally the same causes that sink ships in every other part of the ocean: weather, mechanical failure, human error, and the basic physics of what happens when a heavy object on the surface of a fluid medium encounters forces that exceed its ability to stay afloat. And the Cyclops did not disappear because of the Bermuda Triangle. The Cyclops disappeared because something went wrong aboard a ship carrying too much of the wrong kind of cargo on an engine that was already failing, in waters that were not forgiving of such things. What exactly went wrong, and in what order and how quickly, and whether the 306 people aboard had time to know what was happening to them, is information that the Atlantic has kept for over a century and shows no sign of releasing. There is a specific quality to a wartime disappearance that peacetime disappearances do not share. When the Cyclops vanished in March of 1918, the world was preoccupied with the largest and most destructive war in human history. Hundreds of thousands of people were dying on the Western Front. Ships were being torpedoed across the Atlantic by German submarines at a rate that threatened to sever the supply lines, keeping Britain and France in the fight. The disappearance of a single collier, even one carrying over 300 people, was one loss among many, one entry in a ledger of casualties so large that individual entries could barely be read. The war created a noise floor, a baseline level of death and destruction that was so high that individual tragedies, even extraordinary ones, were absorbed into it and muffled. The war ended 8 months after the Cyclops disappeared. The Navy investigated. The Navy found nothing. The Navy moved on. The families of the 306 lost crew and passengers mourned, and over time they too moved on, as families must. And the ship stayed where it was, wherever it was, at whatever depth the Atlantic placed it, with its cargo of manganese ore, and its troubled captain and its 306 names, and the ocean held it quietly and completely, and did not explain. The night outside your window, if you have a window, is doing its ordinary work. The darkness is not the darkness of the ocean floor. It is the familiar darkness of your own geography, the darkness of street lights or stars or clouds, the darkness that your eyes have adjusted to and that your body has accepted as the condition of rest. The weight of the stories you have heard so far is not a heavy weight. It is the weight of things that happened long ago to people you did not know, in places you have never been, under circumstances that you will never fully understand. That is not a burden. That is just the past being the past, and which is a thing the past is very good at, and which requires nothing of you except the willingness to listen. The next story is different from the ones that came before. The ships we have talked about so far, the Mary Celeste, the Waratah, the Cyclops, were real ships. They existed, they were registered, they were built by known shipyards and sailed by named captains and carried documented cargoes, and their losses are recorded in official maritime records. The evidence for their existence is beyond question, even if the evidence for what happened to them is incomplete. The next ship may not have existed at all, and that, strangely enough, is what makes its story one of the most interesting ones to tell in the dark. The story begins with a distress signal, transmitted in Morse code from somewhere in the Strait of Malacca, on the narrow waterway between the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian island of Sumatra. The signal identified the sending vessel as a Dutch freighter called the Orang Medan. In Malay, Orang means man. Medan is a city on Sumatra. The name translates roughly to man from Medan. The message that this ship allegedly sent out into the warm, humid air of the South Pacific is one of the most chilling sequences of words in maritime lore, and I'm going to tell it to you, but I want you to know, before I do, that the ship that supposedly sent it may never have sailed. The message may never have been transmitted. The events that follow may be entirely fictional, and that uncertainty is part of the story, not a flaw in it. The message, as it has been recorded in various accounts over the decades, went something like this: SOS from Orang Medan, and we float. All officers, including the captain, dead in chart room and on the bridge, probably whole of crew dead. Then a pause. Then a series of confused dots and dashes, incoherent as though the hand on the transmitter was failing, losing coordination, losing the ability to form the patterns that Morse code requires. And then 2 final words, transmitted clearly through the static and the distance and the warm equatorial air. I die. Nothing more. The transmitter went silent. The ship, wherever it was, stopped talking to the world. According to the most commonly repeated version of the story, the distress signal was picked up by 2 American vessels, the Silver Star and the City of Baltimore, as well as by Dutch and British listening posts in the region, and the Silver Star altered course and headed for the position the Orang Medan had given. When she arrived, the crew found the Dutch freighter drifting, apparently undamaged, with no signs of fire or collision or any external force that might explain the silence of her radio. A boarding party crossed from the Silver Star to the Orang Medan and climbed aboard. What they found, according to the story, was a ship of the dead. The crew of the Orang Medan lay where they had fallen, scattered across the decks and in the compartments below. The captain was in the chart room. Officers lay on the bridge. Sailors were sprawled on the deck, in the passageways everywhere, all of them dead, all of them lying on their backs, and all of them, according to every version of the story, wearing expressions of profound terror, mouths open, eyes wide, faces frozen in what the accounts describe as horrible caricatures, as though the last thing each of them saw in the final moment before death was something so frightening that the muscles of the face locked in place and would not release. Even the ship's dog, a small animal found on the deck, was dead, its body positioned as if it too had been staring at something above it in the instant it died. No wounds were visible on any of the bodies, no blood, no signs of violence or struggle. Whatever killed them had not touched them in any way that left a physical mark. They were simply dead, all of them, in postures of extreme fear, aboard a ship that appeared to be structurally intact. And then, according to the story, as the boarding party was preparing to tow the Orang Medan to port, smoke began rising from the cargo hold, and the boarding party retreated to the Silver Star. Within minutes, the Orang Medan exploded, violently enough that the ship was reportedly lifted partially out of the water before sinking into the strait, taking with her the bodies, the cargo, the evidence, and any possibility of determining what had actually happened. It is a remarkable story. It is also almost certainly not true, or rather, it is not verifiable, which is a slightly different thing, and the difference matters. The first and most significant problem with the Orang Medan story is that the ship may never have existed. Lloyd's Register of Ships, which has maintained records of every registered merchant vessel since 1764, contains no entry for a ship named the Orang Medan. No shipping registry in the Netherlands, and which would have been the relevant authority for a Dutch-flagged vessel, has any record of her. No port authority in any country has documentation of the Orang Medan docking, loading cargo or clearing for departure. No shipyard has records of building her. No crew manifest has survived. No insurance records exist. In a profession where paperwork is essential, where every vessel of any significant size generates a paper trail of registrations, inspections, insurance certificates, crew lists and port records, the Orang Medan has left no paper trail at all. The Silver Star, the American vessel that supposedly responded to the distress call and boarded the Orang Medan, did exist. But by 1947, the date most commonly associated with the story, and the Silver Star had been renamed the SS Santa Cecilia, and was operating primarily in South American waters, not in the Strait of Malacca. The city of Baltimore, the other American ship mentioned in some versions, is also a real vessel name, but the connection to the Orang Medan story is similarly difficult to verify. The earliest known account of the Orang Medan story does not come from the 1947 time frame that most tellings cite. A researcher named Estelle Hargraves discovered references to the story in British national newspapers, published in 1940 during the Second World War, 7 years before the events were supposed to have taken place. In this earlier version, the location of the distress call is not the Strait of Malacca, but the waters south of the Solomon Islands, thousands of miles from the later setting, and the ship that responds is not an American vessel, but a British merchant ship. The basic elements of the story, the dead crew, the expressions of terror, the explosion, are present, but the details are significantly different. By 1948, the story appeared again, this time in a Dutch-Indonesian newspaper called De Lokomotief, published in Semarang. This version was more detailed, included descriptions attributed to a sole survivor, and placed the events in the Strait of Malacca. A man named Silvio Shirley, an Italian journalist, appears to have been instrumental in propagating and elaborating the story across multiple publications over the following years. Shirley's reliability as a source has been questioned by multiple researchers. As the historian Michael East has noted, the inconsistent dates, the changing locations, and the shifting details all point to a story that was embellished and republished, rather than reported from the primary sources. In 1952, the story appeared in English in the Proceedings of the Merchant Marine Council, a publication of the United States Coast Guard. This is often cited as the most authoritative source for the story, because the Coast Guard is a serious organization that does not typically publish fiction, but the article, when examined closely, reads more like a retelling of existing accounts than an independent investigation. It is not an official report. It is not the result of a Coast Guard inquiry. It is a dramatic narrative, published in a trade journal, sourced from the same chain of newspaper articles that traces back through Shirley to the original 1940 accounts. A German researcher named Professor Theodor Siersdorfer spent roughly 50 years investigating the Orang Medan case. He discovered a 1953 German booklet by a writer named Otto Mielke, titled Das Totenschiff in der Südsee, or The Death Ship in the South Seas. This booklet contained details about the ship's route, her engine power and the name of her captain, details not found in earlier accounts. It also suggested that the ship's cargo had included potassium cyanide and nitroglycerin, substances that could explain both the death of the crew through toxic gas released by the reaction of these chemicals with seawater and the subsequent explosion. If the Orang Medan was indeed transporting dangerous chemicals, possibly smuggled, possibly the remnants of wartime stockpiles being moved covertly between nations in the chaotic post-war years of the late 1940s, then the absence of official records would make more sense. A ship carrying illicit cargo has every reason to avoid registries and inspections and every reason to disappear from the paper trail. This is the theory that attempts to save the Orang Medan from the category of pure fiction and place it in the more interesting category of suppressed fact. The idea is that the ship was real but unregistered, carrying a cargo so dangerous and so politically sensitive that no government wanted to acknowledge its existence, and that the explosion that destroyed the ship also destroyed the evidence, and that the silence in the official record is not the silence of a story that never happened, but the silence of a story that someone worked very hard to keep quiet. It is a compelling theory. It is also completely unverifiable, and this is the point at which the Orang Medan stops being a maritime mystery and becomes something else, something more like a meditation on the nature of stories and what we want them to do for us. Because here is what is genuinely interesting about the Orang Medan, not the dead crew, not the frozen faces, not the explosion. Those details, if they are real, are horrible, and if they are invented, they are the kind of horrible that a storyteller reaches for when they want to make the ocean feel dangerous and unknowable. What is genuinely interesting is that a story with no verifiable ship, no verifiable crew, no verifiable investigation, no physical evidence of any kind, became one of the most repeated maritime mysteries of the 20th century. It has appeared in books, in magazines, in documentary television series, in a 2019 video game produced by Bandai Namco called Man of Medan. It has been told and retold across languages and decades and media formats, growing more detailed with each retelling, acquiring new facts that cannot be traced to any source, shedding old facts that were inconvenient, evolving the way folk tales evolve, through repetition and embellishment and the quiet, patient work of the human, need to believe that the ocean holds secrets. And maybe it does. The ocean certainly holds things that have not been found. Ships that sank and were never located, cargoes that went to the bottom and have never been recovered, entire crews that walked aboard a vessel and were never seen again. The ocean holds all of these things, literally, in the darkness of the deep. The Orang Medan may be one of those things, a real ship with a real crew that met a real and terrible end, whose records were destroyed or suppressed, whose story survived only in the garbled, evolving form of a tale told by sailors and journalists and researchers, each one adding a layer of interpretation until the original facts, if there were original facts, became impossible to recover. Or the Orang Medan may be nothing, a story invented by a journalist looking for material, repeated by other journalists who did not check the sources, amplified by the human appetite for mystery, and kept alive by the simple fact that a good story, once it exists, is very hard to kill. And even when the evidence says it probably is not true, the story survives because the story fills a need that the evidence does not address, and the need is older and more powerful than the evidence. The need is this: the ocean is vast and dark and largely unknown, and the things that happen on it are often terrible, and we want there to be a reason for the terrible things. We want the dead to have died for a reason, or at least in a way that makes narrative sense. A crew killed by a gas leak from smuggled chemicals makes narrative sense. A crew killed by nothing, by the arbitrary indifference of the sea, does not. And so we reach for the story that makes sense, even when the story cannot be confirmed, because the alternative, which is silence and not knowing, and the possibility that the ocean simply took and did not explain, is harder to sit with, but sitting with it is what the night is for. And tonight, lying wherever you are in whatever quiet has gathered around you, you do not need the Orang Medan to be true in order for it to do its work. The story is here. The uncertainty is here. The ocean, with its real losses and its legendary ones, is out there somewhere in the dark, holding whatever it holds, and you are in here, in this room, with the weight of your body against the surface beneath you, and the sound of your own breathing and the slow, familiar drift towards sleep that has been building since before the first story began. There is one more ship to talk about, one more vessel that left port and produced a mystery, but this one is different from all the others, and the difference is what makes it, in some ways, the most disturbing of all. And the others disappeared. The Mary Celeste was found empty. The Waratah was never found. The Cyclops was never found. The Orang Medan, if it existed, sank and was lost. In all of these cases, the ship was the thing that went wrong. The ship sank, or the ship was abandoned, or the ship vanished and the people went with it. The next ship did not sink. The next ship did not vanish. The next ship was found. 5 weeks after it disappeared, still floating, still structurally sound, still perfectly capable of carrying its passengers safely to their destination. The hull was intact. The design made it virtually impossible to sink. A chief surveyor of ships in New Zealand examined it and said that it would have continued to float indefinitely. The ship survived. 25 people did not, and they left an unsinkable ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and they were never seen again. And no one has ever been able to explain why. Her name was the Joyita. It means little jewel. The Joyita was built in 1931 in Los Angeles by the Wilmington Boat Works, not as a merchant vessel or a warship or a cargo carrier, but as a luxury yacht. She was 69 feet long, wooden-hulled, constructed of cedar planking over oak frames, and she was commissioned by a Hollywood film director named Roland West, who named the boat after his wife, the actress Jewel Carmen. Joyita, Little Jewel, a love letter in the form of a ship. Roland West was a director of noir films, dark stories about crime and betrayal, and the kind of moral ambiguity that Hollywood was beginning to explore in the late 1920s and early 1930s. He directed The Bat Whispers, aussi a 1930 mystery that is considered one of the earliest influences on the Batman mythology. His personal life was complicated in ways that would later attract the attention of historians and true crime writers, but none of that matters to the story of the Joyita. What matters is that he had this boat built, and that the boat was beautiful, and that the boat was strong, and that the boat would outlive everyone who ever owned it or sailed on it or disappeared from it. Through the 1930s, the Joyita cruised the California coast, a pleasure vessel doing pleasure vessel things. In 1936, West sold her. The boat changed hands. When the Second World War began, and the United States Navy needed every vessel it could requisition for patrol duty in the Pacific, the Joyita was pressed into service, designated YP-108, and when assigned to patrol the waters around Hawaii. She spent the war years doing unglamorous but necessary work, watching for submarines, monitoring shipping lanes, the kind of duty that history barely records because nothing dramatic happened during it. After the war, the Joyita was released from naval service and entered a period of declining fortunes. She was sold and resold. She was refitted. At some point during this period, cork lining was added to the hull, installed for refrigeration purposes but carrying an important secondary effect. The cork gave the Joy Eater extraordinary buoyancy. Combined with the natural lightness of her wooden construction, the cork lining meant that the Joy Eater was, for all practical purposes, unsinkable. You could flood her. You could swamp her. You could fill her holds with water until the deck was awash, and then she would still float. The materials she was made of were lighter than the water she sat in, and no amount of flooding could change that fundamental equation. By the early 1950s, the Joy Eater had come into the possession of Dr. Catherine Luomala, a professor of anthropology at the University of Hawaii. Luomala did not have much use for the boat herself, and she lent it on a long-term basis to a friend, a British-born sailor named Captain Thomas Henry Miller, who was known to everyone as Dusty. Miller had been living in Samoa and was trying to make a living from the sea, first as a fishing charter operator, which did not work out, and then as a cargo hauler, which showed slightly more promise. He lived aboard the Joy Eater for periods when money was tight, which was often. He was in debt, he was persistent, and he had the kind of relationship with the ocean that is built on stubbornness rather than romance. The kind where you keep going back not because the sea has been good to you, but because you do not know what else to do. In late September 1955, Miller secured a contract to transport cargo and passengers from Apia, the capital of Samoa, to the Tokelau Islands, a group of atolls roughly 270 miles to the north. The cargo included food, medical supplies and wooden construction materials intended for the White Sunday celebrations, an important holiday in the Tokelau community. The passengers included a medical officer who was travelling to the islands to perform a surgical amputation, 2 pharmacists carrying urgent medical supplies, and several other travellers. There were also 80 empty 45-gallon drums aboard, in which would be used for the cupra storage on the return voyage. The voyage was supposed to take about 2 days. It was routine. The distance was manageable. The weather was not expected to be a problem. The Joy Eater was scheduled to depart Apia at noon on October 2nd, 1955. She did not. The departure was delayed because the port engine's clutch had failed. The clutch could not be repaired in time, so the decision was made to proceed on the starboard engine alone. This is not ideal for a 270-mile ocean crossing, but it was not considered reckless either. The distance was short, the weather appeared favourable, and the Joy Eater, even on one engine, could make the passage in roughly 48 hours. At approximately 5 in the morning on October 3rd, 1955, the Joy Eater finally departed Apia Harbour. Aboard were 25 people, 16 crew and 9 passengers, and the youngest passenger was 3 years old. The Joy Eater never arrived at the Tokelau Islands. When the ship failed to reach its destination within the expected time frame, and when no radio contact could be established, a search was launched. It was extensive. Aircraft and vessels searched nearly 100,000 square miles of the South Pacific. They found nothing. The Joy Eater, her crew, her passengers, her cargo, had simply ceased to be where they were supposed to be. 5 weeks passed. On November 10th, 1955, Captain Gerald Douglas of the merchant ship Tuvalu was sailing through the waters north of Fiji, more than 600 miles from the Joy Eater's intended route, when he spotted something in the water. It was the Joy Eater, or what was left of the Joy Eater above the waterline. The ship was still afloat, listing heavily to port, her decks partially awash, yet drifting with no one aboard. No one. Douglas brought the Tuvalu alongside and his crew boarded the Joy Eater. What they found was a ship that had been battered but not destroyed. The flying bridge was smashed. Deckhouse windows were broken. Someone had rigged a makeshift canvas awning over part of the deck, a sunshade which indicated that the ship had been drifting in the open for a significant period of time with people still aboard, people who had been alive long enough and aware enough of their situation to construct shelter from the sun. The port engine clutch was still disassembled. It had never been repaired. The starboard engine, the only working engine, was covered with a mattress, which was strange and which investigators would later try to explain. On deck, a doctor's bag was found containing surgical instruments, a stethoscope, and blood-stained bandages. Someone aboard had been injured. Someone had received medical treatment. The blood was real. The bandages had been used. The radio was found tuned to 2,182 kilohertz, which is the International Marine Radio Telephone Distress Frequency. Someone had tried to call for help, but the radio's wiring was faulty, so badly deteriorated that its effective range was approximately 2 miles. 2 miles? In the open Pacific, 2 miles is nothing. A distress call with a 2-mile range is a whisper in a cathedral. No one would have heard it. No one did hear it. The ship's clocks, powered by the electrical generator, had stopped at 10:25. The light switches for the navigation lights and the cabin lighting were in the on position, which indicated that whatever happened had happened at night. And the lights had been on because it was dark outside, and then the generator had failed and the clocks had stopped, and the lights had gone out, and from that point forward whatever was happening aboard the Yoita was happening in darkness. The cargo was largely gone. Some of it, the food and medical supplies, was missing. Some items remained. Importantly, some of the passengers' personal belongings were still aboard, and the 80 empty 45-gallon drums were gone, which suggested that someone had used them, perhaps as makeshift flotation devices. 25 people had been aboard the Joyita when she left Apia. None of them were on the ship when the Tuvalu found her. No bodies, no survivors, no message left behind, no explanation for where they went or why they left a ship that could not sink. The investigation, when it came, established what had gone wrong mechanically. A pipe in the raw water circuit of the port auxiliary engine's cooling system had failed due to galvanic corrosion, a chemical reaction between dissimilar metals in contact with seawater. This failure allowed seawater to flow into the bilges through the corroded pipe. The bilge pumps, which should have been able to handle this kind of leak, were not fitted with strainers. Without strainers, the pumps clogged with debris and could not remove the water effectively. The water level rose slowly, inch by inch, in the engine room and the lower decks. The flooding was not catastrophic, it was gradual, and the Joyita, with her cork-lined hull and her wooden construction, was not in danger of sinking regardless of how high the water rose in the bilges. She could not sink, and the physics of her construction made it impossible. V.G. Boyvin, the chief surveyor of ships in the Marine Department in Wellington, New Zealand, examined the Joyita after she was towed to port and stated that, so far as he could see, the Joyita would have continued to float in the condition in which she was found indefinitely. The ship was not going down. She was listing, yes. She was waterlogged, yes. But she was floating, and she was going to keep floating for as long as the ocean existed to hold her up. This is the question that makes the Joyita case so difficult. Not what happened to the ship, because the ship survived. The question is why 25 people left it. The formal inquiry, convened in Apia in February 1956, heard testimony from maritime experts, from people who knew Captain Miller, and from investigators who had examined the ship. At the end of the inquiry, the commissioners released their finding. The fate of the crew and passengers, they said, was inexplicable. That word is worth sitting with. Inexplicable. Not unknown, not undetermined. Inexplicable. The commissioners had the evidence, they had the ship, they had the testimony, and they still could not construct a scenario that explained why 25 people would voluntarily leave an unsinkable vessel in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The theories that emerged after the inquiry are numerous, and none of them is fully satisfying. The most commonly accepted reconstruction, advanced by Robin Morm, a British author who later purchased the Joyita and spent years investigating her history, goes something like this. The flooding began with the corroded pipe. The pumps failed, and the water rose in the engine room. Captain Miller, knowing the ship was unsinkable, wanted to press on. He was in debt. The contract to deliver cargo to the Tokelau Islands represented income he desperately needed, but the rising water alarmed the crew and passengers, particularly Charles Simpson, the first mate, who may have demanded that Miller turn back. A disagreement escalated. Perhaps a physical confrontation. The blood-stained bandages suggest that someone was seriously injured, and if that someone was Captain Miller, the one person aboard who knew the Joyita was unsinkable and who would have insisted that everyone stay with the ship, then his incapacitation would have removed the only voice of reason from the decision-making process. Without Miller to tell them, the ship could not sink. The crew and passengers, who were watching the water rise, feeling the ship list further and further to one side, hearing the waves break over the gunwale, may have concluded that the ship was going down and that their only hope was the life rafts. They were wrong. The ship was not going down, but they did not know that, and in the darkness at night, with the generator failed and the lights out, and the water sloshing around their ankles and the ship leaning at an angle that felt to people who were not experienced sailors like the beginning of the end, the decision to leave may have felt not only rational, but urgent. The Joyita carried 3 lifeboats. They were small. They were not designed for 25 people. They were not equipped with navigation instruments or significant provisions, but they were better than nothing, or they seemed to be. And in the moment when the decision was made to leave, 25 people climbed into lifeboats in the South Pacific at night, in a sea state that was at least moderately rough, and they left behind a ship that would still be floating 5 weeks later when the Tuvalu found her. They chose the open ocean over the unsinkable ship, and the open ocean took them. Not one of them was ever found. Not a body. Not a lifeboat. Not a piece of wreckage identifiable as belonging to the Joyita's complement of people or gear. The Pacific, which is the largest ocean on Earth, covering more area than all the land on the planet combined, absorbed 25 human beings and whatever vessels they were travelling in and produced no trace of any of them, not then and not in the 70 years since. There is a specific detail from the aftermath that I find difficult to stop thinking about. As recently as the last few years, a Tokelauan community leader named Luther Alafia Toloa, who is a descendant of one of the 25 people who vanished aboard the Joyita, has been calling on the New Zealand government to formally declare all of the missing dead. As of his most recent public statements, only 6 of the 25 people aboard the Joyita have been officially declared deceased. The 6 who have been declared dead are the European passengers and crew members whose families had the resources and the legal standing to pursue formal death certificates. The remaining 19, the Samoan, Tokelauan, and Kiribati crew members and passengers, have never been formally declared dead. They exist, in the bureaucratic sense, in a kind of limbo, and neither alive nor dead, unresolved, the way the Joyita herself existed for 5 weeks in the Pacific, neither sailing nor sunk, drifting between categories belonging to none of them. The Joyita herself had a strange afterlife. After the inquiry, she was auctioned for roughly £2,400 and purchased by a new owner who refitted her and put her back to work. She ran aground near Korea in 1957. She ran aground again at Nassova in 1959. She was sold again. In 1962, Robin Morn bought her and spent years investigating her history, publishing his findings as a book called The Joyita Mystery. The ship continued to exist, battered and repaired and battered again, long after the people who had sailed on her had disappeared into the Pacific, and the mystery of their disappearance had hardened into something permanent, and something that the ocean was not going to give back. The room you are in has walls that work. The surfaces around you are solid and stable, and they are not going to shift or flood or tilt while you are lying here. This is one of those things that the body knows without thinking about, one of those quiet certainties that forms the baseline of rest, the unconscious trust that the space you are in will continue to be the space you are in, that the floor will remain the floor and the ceiling will remain the ceiling, and the relationship between your body and the room it occupies will not change while you are not paying attention. 25 people on the Hoita, lost that certainty. The floor became the water, the ceiling became the sky. The room they were in stopped being a room and became a list and a leak and a rising waterline. And they made a decision, the wrong decision, as it turned out, but the only decision they could see in the dark, which was to leave, and leaving killed them. Not the ocean, not the storm, not the flooding, the leaving. There is something about that which sits differently from the other stories. The Mary Celeste's crew may have made a similar mistake, leaving a seaworthy ship in a panic and finding that the ocean was less forgiving than the ship they had left behind. But the Mary Celeste is old enough that the horror has been sanded down by time, polished into a mystery rather than a tragedy. The Joyita is closer. 1955. There are people alive today who were alive when it happened. There are families who are still waiting for the bureaucratic acknowledgement that their relatives are gone. The Joyita is not a legend. It is a wound that has not been formally closed. Let us be quiet for a moment. Not because the next story requires a transition, but because the weight of what you have heard deserves a pause. The body knows when it has taken in enough for a while. The mind can keep going, the mind can always keep going, but the body has its own rhythm, its own pacing, and right now the body is telling you something about rest, and about the difference between thinking and being still, and about the slow, heavy pulling downward feeling in the shoulders and the eyelids that means the night is working. The next part of this is not about a ship. It is about the thing that holds the ships, that takes the ships, that keeps the ships and the people and the cargo and the unanswered questions. It is about the ocean itself, and there is a thing that sailors in earlier centuries understood about the night sky that most people alive today have never had to learn. The stars move. Not perceptibly, not in the way that a car moves or a bird moves or a hand moves across a table, but in the slow, rotational motion of the celestial sphere as the earth turns beneath it, a motion that carries the constellations from east to west across the sky over the course of a night, each star tracing an arc whose shape depends on its position relative to the celestial pole. If you are lying on your back right now, and if there is a window above you or near you that shows a piece of sky, and if the sky happens to be clear, and if the light pollution where you live is not so severe that it has washed the stars out of visibility entirely, then the stars you can see are moving right now. And at this moment, imperceptibly but continuously, the entire dome of the sky rotating around a fixed point that, in the northern hemisphere, sits very close to a star called Polaris, the North Star, which is the one star that does not move, or rather the one star whose apparent motion is so small that it appears fixed while everything else turns around it. For thousands of years, this was how people found their way on the ocean. Not the only way. There were compasses, and there were dead reckoning calculations, based on speed and heading and elapsed time, and there were charts and pilots and the accumulated lore of seafaring communities that knew the currents and the landmarks and the seasonal patterns of wind and weather. But at the foundation of oceanic navigation, beneath all the instruments and techniques that were developed over the centuries, was the simple fact that the stars are predictable. They rise at known times. They set at known times. Their positions relative to the horizon at any given moment can be calculated, and from those calculations, a navigator can determine where on the surface of the earth they are standing or floating, with a precision that improves with the quality of the instruments and the skill of the person using them. Captain Briggs of the Mary Celeste navigated by the stars. Captain Ilbery of the Waratah navigated by the stars. Captain Worley of the Cyclops navigated by the stars, though by 1918 there were also other tools available. Captain Miller of the Joyita had access to more modern instruments but still operated in a world where the fundamental relationship between a vessel and the sky above it was the same relationship that had existed since the first sailor looked up and realized that the stars could tell him where he was. When these captains stood on the deck of their ships at night, they saw the same stars you can see tonight, or a version of them shifted slightly by the precession of the equinoxes over the intervening decades and centuries, but recognisably the same patterns, the same constellations, the same slow rotation of the sky around the pole. They saw the stars reflected in the water beneath them, doubled, the sky above and its mirror below, and between the two skies the ship, in the thin shell of wood or steel that held them above the water, and allowed them to exist in a place where human beings are not naturally meant to exist. The loneliness of that position is difficult to overstate. A ship at sea at night, out of sight of land, surrounded by water in every direction, with the stars above and the deep below, and nothing in between except the ship and the people on it, and the cargo in the hold, and the sound of the water against the hull, the endless, repetitive, unchanging sound of the ocean moving past the sides of the ship, a sound that can be soothing or maddening, depending on how long you have been listening to it, and how far you are from anywhere you could call home. Every one of the ships we have discussed tonight reached a point in their voyage where they were alone, and not alone in the sense that no other ships were nearby, although in most cases that was true as well. Alone in the deeper sense that the ocean imposes on everything that crosses it. The sense of being separated from the world of solid ground and fixed structures and reliable surfaces by a distance that cannot be crossed on foot, that requires a vessel, that requires the ongoing cooperation of the water and the weather and the mechanical systems that keep the vessel moving and the people aboard alive. At sea you are dependent in a way that life on land rarely requires, dependent on the ship, dependent on the weather, dependent on the skill of the navigator and the soundness of the hull and the functioning of the engines and the accuracy of the charts and the patience of the ocean. When any one of these dependencies fails, and the isolation becomes something else, it becomes exposure. You are exposed to the ocean in the way that a climber who falls from a cliff is exposed to gravity. The thing that was beneath you, supporting you, allowing you to exist in a place you could not exist without it, has ceased to perform its function. And what remains is the raw, unmediated relationship between your body and the physical environment. And the physical environment, which is water, is not designed for your survival. Water is designed for fish. Water is designed for plankton. Water is designed for the organisms that evolved over billions of years to extract oxygen from it and move through it and reproduce in it. Your water is not designed for a 150-pound mammal that breathes air and maintains an internal temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit and loses heat to cold water at a rate that can kill in under an hour depending on the temperature. This is what the people aboard these ships faced when things went wrong, not the mystery, not the conspiracy, not the supernatural forces or the legendary creatures, or any of the other explanations that human imagination has draped over these events in the years since they happened. What they faced was the ocean, unmediated, with the ship that was supposed to protect them from it no longer doing its job, and the ocean, which does not care about their fear or their prayers or their expertise or their rank, or the names of their children or the plans they had made for when they reached port, did what the ocean does, which is be the ocean, vast and cold and indifferent and final. The stars above them were the same stars that are above you now. The water beneath them was the same water that is out there somewhere in the dark right now, moving the way it has always moved, carrying the things it has always carried, keeping the things it has always kept. The distance between their experience and yours is measured in years and miles, and the thickness of the walls around you, and the solidity of the surface beneath you, and the simple, extraordinary fact that you are not on the ocean tonight. You are in a room. The room holds you the way the water held their ships, steadily, reliably, without asking anything in return. And the night is nearly done, or it is moving toward its deepest point, or it is wherever it is, and you are wherever you are inside it, and the stories have done what stories do, which is carry you somewhere and then bring you back, and the place they have brought you back to is here, which is where you started, which is where the water in the pipes was murmuring, and the refrigerator was humming, and the body was heavy, and the mind was reaching, and the night was offering the same thing it always offers, which is rest, if you are willing to take it. The ocean has no opinion about the ships that cross it. This sounds obvious, but it is worth saying explicitly, because the stories we have been telling tonight, and the way we tell stories in general about the sea, tend to give the ocean a personality it does not possess. We say the ocean is angry when the waves are high. We say the ocean is calm when the surface is flat. We say the ocean took the ship, as though the taking were a deliberate act, a decision made by a sentient body of water that chose this particular vessel on this particular day for its own inscrutable reasons. The ocean does none of these things. The ocean is water, an enormous quantity of water, approximately 1.335 billion cubic kilometers of it, distributed across the planet's surface in basins that were shaped by tectonic forces operating over hundreds of millions of years. The water moves because physics makes it move. Winds drive surface currents. Temperature differences between the equator and the poles drive deep ocean circulation. The rotation of the Earth deflects the currents into vast rotating systems called gyres. The gravitational pull of the moon and the sun produces tides. And beneath all of this, at the molecular level, the water is simply doing what water does, which is flow from where it is to where it is not, following gradients of pressure and temperature and salinity in patterns so complex that even modern oceanography, with its satellite arrays and autonomous underwater vehicles and computational models running on some of the most powerful computers ever built, can only approximate what is happening at any given moment in any given cubic meter of the global ocean. The ships that cross this water are, from the ocean's perspective, which is to say from the perspective of physics, temporary disturbances. A ship displaces water. It pushes the water aside and the water pushes back, and as long as the upward force of the displaced water equals or exceeds the downward force of the ship's weight, the ship floats. This is Archimedes' principle. You understood for over 2,000 years, as basic a piece of physics as exists. Floating is not complicated. What is complicated is staying afloat when the water you are floating on decides, which is to say when the physics dictates that the conditions that were keeping you up have changed. A wave is a transfer of energy through the surface of the water. The water itself does not move horizontally when a wave passes through it. The water moves in a circular motion, rising and falling as the energy passes, returning more or less to its original position after the wave has gone. What moves is the shape, the peak and the trough, the pattern of high and low that your eye reads as a wave rolling across the surface. In calm conditions, waves are small, regular, predictable. In storm conditions, the energy being fed into the surface of the ocean by wind increases dramatically, and the waves grow in height, in length, in power. A wave 10 meters high, which is about 33 feet, carries a force that is difficult to comprehend from the safety of dry land. A breaking wave of that height, hitting the hull of a ship, delivers a force measured in tons per square meter. It is the equivalent of being struck by a wall of concrete moving at highway speed, except the wall is liquid and it reforms and strikes again and again and again, for as long as the wind keeps feeding energy into the water. Most ships are designed to survive this. Modern cargo vessels, tankers, container ships, cruise liners, all of them are engineered to withstand sea states that would have been unsurvivable in earlier centuries. The hulls are made of steel, and the structures are computer-modelled to distribute the forces of waves across the entire frame. Watertight compartments prevent flooding in one section from spreading to others. Stabilization systems reduce rolling. Weather routing. The practice of using forecasts to choose a course that avoids the worst conditions has become standard. And still, ships sink. Not often. Not at the rate they sank in the age of sail, when losing a ship to the weather was a routine cost of doing business, but often enough that the insurance companies that cover maritime commerce, Lloyd's of London chief among them, maintain detailed records of every vessel lost, and the records show that the ocean has not been tamed. It has been made somewhat safer to cross, somewhat more predictable, somewhat less likely to kill you on any given voyage, but the fundamental relationship between a ship and the water it floats on has not changed. The ship is a solid object. The water is a fluid medium. The solid object can be broken by the fluid medium if the conditions are right, and the conditions are right more often than most people who have never been to sea would expect. There is a specific phenomenon that deserves attention here, because it connects several of the stories we have been telling tonight, and because it was, for most of human history, considered to be a myth. Rogue waves. The name itself suggests something outside the normal order. A rogue is something that does not follow the rules, that deviates from the expected pattern, that appears where it should not be, and does what it should not do. A rogue wave is exactly that. It is a wave that is significantly larger than the surrounding sea state, a wave that rises out of the ocean surface without warning and without the kind of gradual build-up that a sailor might read as a sign to brace for impact. Rogue waves can be 2, 3, even 4 times the height of the average waves around them. They appear and disappear quickly. They are not sustained the way storm waves are sustained. They are singular events. One enormous wall of water that arrives, does its damage, and subsides, leaving behind a sea state that looks no different from the sea state that preceded it. For centuries, sailors reported encountering these waves. They told stories of walls of water 80 or 100 feet high, appearing without warning in seas that were rough, but not extraordinarily so, striking their vessels with forces that snapped masts and stove in hatches, and in some cases sank the ship entirely. These accounts were dismissed by the scientific community. The prevailing models of ocean wave dynamics held that waves of the size described by sailors were statistically impossible under normal conditions. The models predicted a maximum wave height based on wind speed and duration and fetch, the distance over which the wind has been blowing, and the numbers simply did not support the existence of waves as large as the ones the sailors described. On January 1st, 1995, an instrument on the Dropner oil platform in the North Sea recorded a wave with a maximum height of 25.6 meters, roughly 84 feet, surrounded by waves averaging approximately 12 meters. The Dropner wave, as it became known, it was the first rogue wave measured by scientific instruments. It was real. It was enormous. And it occurred in a sea state that the prevailing models had predicted would not produce a wave of that size. The sailors had been telling the truth. The models had been wrong. Since the Dropner wave, the study of rogue waves has become an active area of oceanographic research. We now know that rogue waves occur more frequently than the old models predicted, though they are still rare. We know that they can occur in any ocean basin, under a variety of sea conditions. We know that they are particularly common in areas where strong currents meet, because the interaction between the current and the surface waves can focus energy in ways that amplify individual waves far beyond what the general sea state would suggest. The waters off the southeast coast of South Africa, where the warm Agulhas current flowing south meets colder Antarctic waters pushing north, are known to be one of the most prolific regions for rogue wave generation on Earth. This is where the Waratah disappeared. Off the coast of the eastern cape of South Africa, in waters where the Agulhas current produces conditions that modern oceanography recognizes as rogue wave territory. A 500-foot steamship loaded with 1,000 tons of lead and 300 tons of lead, or concentrate, a cargo that could shift and destabilize the vessel in heavy seas, encountered severe weather in a region where a single wave of extraordinary size could have appeared without warning and struck the ship before anyone aboard had time to react. We do not know that this is what happened. We will probably never know. But we know that the conditions for it were there, and we know that those conditions produce exactly the kind of event that would account for the sudden, total, trace-free disappearance of a large vessel. The Cyclops may have encountered something similar. The waters between Barbados and the Virginia Capes are not as notorious for rogue waves as the Agulhas current region, but the western Atlantic in March is not a gentle body of water either. A ship running on one engine, loaded with a dense cargo that may have been prone to shifting, encountering unexpected severe weather, could have been overwhelmed by a wave or a series of waves that exceeded her structural capacity. The time between the onset of catastrophic flooding and the point of no return, in a ship carrying 11,000 tons of manganese ore, could have been measured in minutes, and there may not have been time to send a distress signal. There may not have been time to do anything except understand that the ship was going down, and that the water was coming in, and that the weight of the cargo was pulling the hull deeper with every second. The Mary Celeste probably did not encounter a rogue wave. The evidence does not support that kind of sudden, violent event. The ship was found intact, afloat, seaworthy. Whatever happened to the Mary Celeste was quieter than a rogue wave. But the ocean that held the Mary Celeste, the North Atlantic in November, is the same ocean that has taken thousands of other ships over the centuries, through storms and waves and the simple arithmetic of weight and buoyancy, and the point at which the latter is no longer sufficient to overcome the former. And what happens to a ship when it sinks is not something most people think about, and there's no reason you should think about it tonight, unless the thinking is the kind that moves slowly and carries weight and settles into the body rather than agitating the mind. This is that kind of thinking. A ship that loses buoyancy does not drop straight down like a stone. Steel ships, which most modern vessels are, sink bow first or stern first, depending on where the flooding is concentrated. The air trapped inside the hull provides residual buoyancy, which means the ship descends at an angle, air escaping from hatches and vents and broken portals as the water pressure increases with depth. The sound of a sinking ship, if you were somehow able to hear it from outside the hull, it would be a series of groans and shrieks as the metal structure deforms under the increasing pressure, punctuated by explosions of escaping air and the deep, percussive thud of compartments collapsing as the hull descends below the depth that their construction can withstand. The descent takes time. A large ship sinking in the deep water can take 15 to 30 minutes to reach the bottom, depending on the depth, the degree of flooding, and the amount of air trapped inside. During that time, objects break free from the hull: cargo, furniture, equipment, personal belongings. Anything not bolted down or welded in place is released into the water column and drifts, either floating toward the surface if it is lighter than water, or sinking alongside the hull if it is heavier. This is why sinking ships leave debris fields on the ocean floor, scattered halos of material surrounding the main wreck, and why the discovery of a debris field is often the first sign that a searcher has found what they are looking for. But debris on the surface is another matter. In the hours and days after a sinking floating debris, life jackets, wooden furniture, barrels, clothing spreads across the surface, carried by currents and wind, dispersing outward from the point of sinking in a pattern that becomes progressively wider and thinner over time. If a search vessel arrives at the point of sinking within a few hours, the debris field may still be concentrated enough to find. If the search vessel arrives days later, the debris may have spread over hundreds of square miles, individual objects separated by miles of empty water, each one drifting on its own trajectory, each one a tiny piece of evidence, being carried steadily away from the place it is evidence of. This is why the Waratah's debris was never found. This is why the Cyclops' debris was never found, not necessarily because the evidence did not exist, but because the ocean dispersed it faster than the searchers could find it, carried it away from the place where the ships went down, distributed it across an area so large that no search, however well organised, could cover it all. The ocean is not hiding the evidence. The ocean is doing what the ocean always does, which is move. And when the ocean moves, everything in it moves with it, and what was once a field of wreckage becomes, over time, a scattering of individual objects separated by miles of open water, and then eventually, nothing at all. The wood waterlogs and sinks, and the metal corrodes and breaks apart. The fabric disintegrates. The bodies are consumed by the organisms that live in the water and that have been consuming whatever the ocean gives them for as long as there have been organisms in the ocean. The evidence becomes the ocean. The ship becomes the seafloor. The people become the chemistry of the water they sailed on. This is not a comforting thought, but it is not intended to be a frightening one either. It is simply what happens. It is the physics and the biology and the chemistry of what it means for a human-made object and the human beings aboard it to enter the ocean and not come back. The ocean is not cruel. The ocean is not kind. The ocean is a body of water, and what it does with the things it is given it does without intention or malice or mercy. And the same water that destroys a ship carries a child across a swimming pool. The same chemistry that dissolves a hull over centuries nourishes the organisms that form the base of the marine food chain. The ocean is not selective about what it does. It does everything all the time, to everything, and the outcomes depend entirely on what you are, and where you are, and how much force the water happens to be exerting at the moment you encounter it. There is a concept in maritime law and maritime insurance called the perils of the sea. It is a legal term that refers to the risks inherent in ocean travel, the risks that cannot be eliminated by good seamanship or sound engineering or careful navigation, because they arise from the nature of the ocean itself. Storms, waves, currents, the gradual corrosion of metal by salt water, and the sudden failure of a component that has been weakened by years of exposure to the marine environment. The perils of the sea are not acts of negligence or carelessness. They are the irreducible risks of placing a human-made structure on the surface of a natural system that is indifferent to the structure's survival. Every ship that sails is accepting these perils. Every person who boards a ship is accepting these perils, whether they know it or not, whether they think about it or not. The acceptance is built into the act of boarding. It has been built into the act of boarding since the first person climbed into the first hollowed-out log and pushed off from the shore and trusted the water to hold them. Most of the time the trust is justified. The water holds, the ship sails, the people arrive, and the crossing is completed without incident, and the perils of the sea remain, a legal abstraction, a category in an insurance policy, a risk that was accepted and not called upon. And sometimes the trust is not justified. Sometimes the water takes. Sometimes the ship does not arrive. Sometimes the people do not come back. And when that happens, the ocean does not explain itself. It does not send a message or leave a note or provide a diagram of what went wrong. It simply continues being the ocean, the same ocean it was before the ship sailed. The same ocean it will be after the last ship has ever sailed, if such a time ever comes, moving and mixing and carrying and dissolving and returning everything it is given to the chemistry from which it came. The Bermuda Triangle deserves a brief mention here, not because it explains any of the stories we have told tonight, but because it is the explanation that many people reach for when they hear about ships that disappeared in the Western Atlantic, and it is worth understanding why the explanation does not work. The Bermuda Triangle is a loosely defined region of the Western Atlantic Ocean, bounded very roughly by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. It entered popular culture in the 1960s and 1970s, primarily through a series of books and magazine articles that claimed the area experienced a disproportionate number of ship and aircraft disappearances, and that these disappearances were caused by some unknown force, whether magnetic anomalies, methane gas eruptions from the seafloor, residual energy from the lost city of Atlantis, or extraterrestrial interference. And the appeal of the Bermuda Triangle as an explanation is understandable. It offers a single unified cause for a collection of events that are otherwise disconnected and unexplained. It turns the randomness of maritime disaster into a pattern, and patterns are comforting, even when the pattern points towards something frightening, because a pattern implies that the universe is organized, that there are rules, that if you can understand the rules you can avoid the danger. The Bermuda Triangle says, ships disappear here because of something about here, and that is easier to live with than the alternative, which is, ships disappear everywhere, for a variety of reasons, most of which are mundane and all of which are the result of the ordinary physics of objects on water and weather. Lloyd's of London, and which has been insuring ships since the late 17th century, and which has a financial interest in knowing where ships are most likely to be lost, has stated that the Bermuda Triangle does not have a statistically abnormal rate of maritime losses compared to other regions with similar traffic volumes. The United States Coast Guard has reached the same conclusion. The Bermuda Triangle is a busy stretch of ocean. A lot of ships cross it. A lot of aircraft fly over it. Some of them encounter problems. Some of those problems result in losses. The rate at which this happens is consistent with what you would expect from any comparably busy stretch of ocean, and is explained by the same factors that explain maritime losses everywhere: weather, mechanical failure, human error, and the basic reality that the ocean is not a highway, and the things that travel on it are subject to forces that no amount of engineering can entirely eliminate. The Cyclops did not disappear because of the Bermuda Triangle. The Cyclops disappeared because something went catastrophically wrong aboard a ship that was overloaded, under-engined, structurally compromised, and commanded by a captain whose judgment was, by multiple accounts, unreliable. The Bermuda Triangle is a story. The ocean is a fact, and the facts of the ocean are sufficient to explain the loss of the Cyclops without invoking anything more exotic than the perils of the sea. The floor of the ocean is not flat. This is another one of those facts that most people know in the abstract, but have never been asked to feel. The ocean floor has mountains taller than Everest. It has trenches deeper than any canyon on land. It has vast abyssal plains, stretching for thousands of miles, covered in a fine sediment of organic material that has been drifting down through the water column for millions of years, settling at a rate so slow that a centimetre of accumulation can represent 1,000 years of uninterrupted deposition. The floor of the ocean is a landscape, as varied and as dramatic as any landscape on the surface, and it exists in permanent darkness, under pressures that would crush a human body like a paper cup, at temperatures just a few degrees above freezing. This is where the ships go. Not all of them. Some ships sink in shallow water, in harbours, in coastal zones where the depth is measured in tens of metres rather than thousands. These wrecks are accessible. They can be dived on, surveyed, photographed, salvaged. And the Titanic sits in 12,500 feet of water in the North Atlantic, deep enough to be extremely difficult to reach, but not so deep that it has been beyond the range of submersibles and remotely operated vehicles. It was found in 1985, 73 years after it sank, and it has been visited, filmed, and studied extensively since then. But the Titanic is an exception. The Titanic was looked for because it was famous, because its loss was one of the defining catastrophes of the 20th century, because finding it would be a historical event in its own right. Most ships that sink are not famous. Most ships that sink are working vessels, cargo carriers, tankers, fishing boats, the anonymous infrastructure of global commerce, and when they go down without fanfare, and the effort to find them is limited by practical considerations of cost and benefit. If the cargo is not valuable enough to justify a deep-sea salvage operation, if the insurance claim has already been settled, if the families of the lost have made their peace with not knowing, then the ship stays where the ocean put it, and the ocean slowly, patiently, over years and decades and centuries, does what it does to everything it holds. What the ocean does to a ship on the bottom depends on the depth, the temperature, the salinity, the current, and the composition of the ship itself. A wooden ship in cold, deep water can be remarkably well preserved. Wood submerged in cold salt water, in the absence of light and in conditions of low oxygen, degrades slowly. The timbers swell and soften, but maintain their shape. The iron fasteners corrode and weaken, but the structure, held together by its own waterlogged weight, can remain recognizable for centuries. Wrecks from the age of sail have been found on the ocean floor, with their hulls largely intact, their masts still standing, their cargo still stacked in the holds, looking from a distance like ships that simply decided to stop sailing and settle to the bottom for a rest. A steel ship in the same conditions fares differently. Steel corrodes in salt water. The process is electrochemical. The iron in the steel reacts with the dissolved oxygen in the water and with the chloride ions in the salt, producing iron oxide, which is rust. In the deep ocean, where temperatures are low and oxygen levels are reduced, this process is slow but relentless. A steel hull on the ocean floor loses material at a rate that varies depending on local conditions, but that can be measured over decades in millimeters per year. This does not sound like much, and over a human lifetime it is not much, but over centuries it is enough to reduce a ship to an unrecognizable mound of corroded metal, a rust-coloured reef on the abyssal plain, indistinguishable from the natural geology around it except for the regularity of certain shapes and the presence of materials that do not occur naturally at that depth. The organisms of the deep ocean accelerate this process. Bacteria that metabolize iron and sulfur colonize the surfaces of steel wrecks, forming structures called rusticles, stalactite-like formations of biological and chemical origin that hang from the hull and superstructure of the ship like the drippings of a slow, patient acid. The Titanic is being consumed by these organisms. The rate of consumption has been estimated by various researchers, and while the estimates vary, the consensus is that the Titanic's hull is deteriorating significantly faster than was expected when the wreck was first surveyed in the 1980s, and that within the next few decades the ship's structure may collapse entirely, leaving a debris field on the ocean floor where the recognizable shape of a ship used to be. This is what time does to ships in the ocean. It dissolves them, not quickly, not violently, but with the same patience that the ocean applies to everything. Given enough time, the ocean will reduce any human-made object to its constituent elements and incorporate those elements into the chemistry of the seawater and the geology of the seafloor. The ship becomes the ocean. The iron in the hull becomes the iron in the water. The copper in the wiring becomes the copper in the sediment. The calcium in the bones of the crew, if there are bones, becomes the calcium in the shells of the organisms that live in the water above. Everything goes back. Everything is returned. The ocean is the world's largest recycling system, operating on a time scale that makes human industry look like a sneeze. The ships we have talked about tonight are all somewhere in this process. The Mary Celeste, or what remains of her, lies on the Rocheleau Reef off Haiti, where she was deliberately run aground in 1885, and the reef has been incorporating her timbers into its structure for nearly 140 years. The Waratah, if the best theories are correct, lies on the ocean floor off the eastern cape of South Africa, at a depth that has made her inaccessible to every search expedition that has attempted to find her for over a century. The Cyclops is in the Atlantic somewhere between Barbados and Virginia, at whatever depth the bottom reaches in that part of the ocean, with her 11,000 tons of manganese ore holding her down like ballast, which, in a sense, it is. The Joyita, remarkably, did not sink at all. She was salvaged, repaired, put back to work, run aground twice more, sold, resold, investigated, written about, and eventually broken up. She outlived her mystery. The ocean did not get to keep her. The Orang Medan, if she existed, is in the Strait of Malacca, or south of the Solomon Islands, or in the Bay of Bengal, depending on which version of the story you believe. If the explosion that reportedly destroyed her was as violent as the accounts describe, there may be very little left. An explosion followed by a rapid sinking in warm tropical waters, where biological activity is high and corrosion is fast, would leave a debris field that could be difficult to distinguish from the surrounding seafloor after 70 or 80 years. And then there are the people. This is the part that is hardest to sit with, and I want to approach it carefully. Because it is late, and you are tired, and the purpose of this is not to disturb you but to accompany you, and there is a difference between a thought that unsettles and a thought that simply acknowledges what is true. And the people who were lost aboard these ships are gone, not in the euphemistic sense in which we sometimes use that word, where gone means deceased, and we say gone because the other word is harder to say. Gone in the literal physical sense. Their bodies entered the ocean, either through drowning or through going down with a sinking vessel, or through exposure in an open lifeboat, and the ocean did with their bodies what it does with everything it receives. The biological processes of decomposition, accelerated by the temperature and salinity and microbial environment of seawater, began immediately. The organisms that live in the ocean, from bacteria to fish to the various creatures that scavenge the deep, consume the organic material. The skeletal remains, if they reach the ocean floor, were subject to the same slow dissolution that affects everything on the bottom, the same patient chemistry that is currently reducing the Titanic to a mound of rust and sediment. After a century and a half, there are no physical remains of the crew of the Mary Celeste. After over a century, there are no physical remains of the passengers and crew of the Waratah or the Cyclops. After 70 years, there are no physical remains of the 25 people who left the Joyita. The ocean has completed its work. The people have been returned to the chemistry of the water that carried them, and the water has moved on, mixing and circulating and carrying the dissolved elements of what were once human beings through the global ocean circulation system, distributing them across the planet's waters in concentrations so infinitesimal as to be unmeasurable, but not, in principle, non-existent. This is not a poetic metaphor, it is a description of what happens. The calcium from a bone becomes part of the ocean's calcium budget. The iron from blood becomes part of the ocean's iron budget. The carbon from organic tissue becomes part of the ocean's carbon cycle, taken up by phytoplankton and released as carbon dioxide and taken up again in the endless cycling of elements that makes the ocean a living system, rather than a static body of water. The ocean is alive not in the metaphorical sense, but in the biological sense, teeming with organisms at every depth and in every temperature zone. Organisms that depend for their existence on the continuous input of chemical elements from every source the ocean can access, including over the long span of geological time, the bodies of every creature that has ever lived and died in or on or near its waters. The people who were lost from these ships are part of the ocean now. This is true in the same way that it is true that the atoms in your body were once part of stars, which is to say it is literally true and also so vast in its implications that the mind tends to skate over it rather than sit with it. But tonight, if you are willing, it might be worth letting the thought settle, not as a cause for sadness, not as a cause for anything, just as a fact about what happens when the ocean takes and does not give back. The taking is complete. The silence that follows is not empty. It is full of the same water it was always full of, and the water now contains, in trace amounts too small to measure, the elements of the people who sailed on these ships and did not return. There is a map of the ocean floor that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration maintains, and if you look at it, if you zoom out far enough to see the whole of the Atlantic, or the whole of the Pacific, or the whole of the Indian Ocean, what you see is a landscape of such scale and complexity that the idea of finding a single ship on it, even a ship the size of the Waratah or the Cyclops, becomes absurd. The ocean floor is 139 million square miles of terrain, most of it unmapped at high resolution. We have better maps of the surface of Mars than we have of the floor of the ocean that covers the majority of our own planet, and the ships are down there, somewhere, most of them, the ones that sank. But down there is a very large place, and the ships, even the biggest of them, are very small objects in a very large darkness, and the darkness is not illuminated by anything except the occasional passage of a research submersible or an autonomous underwater vehicle on a mission to map a small section of a floor that extends in every direction for thousands of miles. This is why the mysteries persist. Not because the ocean is hiding things, not because there is some supernatural force preventing discovery, but because the ocean is large beyond the capacity of the human mind to fully grasp, and deep beyond the capacity of human technology to fully search, and the ships and people it has taken are distributed across this vastness in locations that may never be found, because finding them would require a search effort of a scale that no government or institution has ever been willing to fund for the sake of answering a historical question. The Waratah has been searched for on at least 9 separate expeditions since 1983, organised by Clive Cussler's Numa and by the South African explorer Emlyn Brown, and she has not been found. The Cyclops has been the subject of intermittent search efforts by the United States Navy and by private organisations, and she has not been found. The wreck of the Mary Celeste was thought to have been identified in the 2001 and was later proven to be a different ship. The ocean keeps its own records, in its own filing system, at its own pace, and it does not consult with the people who are looking. The night has been going on for a while now, and the stories have been accumulating in the quiet the way sediment accumulates on the ocean floor, slowly, layer by layer, each one settling on top of the one before it, adding weight without adding urgency. The weight is not unpleasant. It is the weight of things you do not need to carry, things you can set down at any time, things that are not asking you to do anything except lie here and listen or not listen, and let the night do what the night does, which is pass. The ocean is out there right now, wherever you are in relation to the nearest coast. It is doing its work in the dark, the same work it does in the light, which is move. The currents are running. The waves are forming and breaking and forming again, somewhere in the Atlantic, and the Gulf Stream is carrying warm water from the tropics toward northern Europe at a speed of roughly 4 miles per hour. Somewhere in the Pacific the great gyres are turning, vast slow whirlpools of current that take years to complete a single rotation. Somewhere in the Indian Ocean, the monsoon currents are reversing direction, as they do every 6 months, in response to the changing seasons and the shifting patterns of atmospheric pressure that drive the winds, that drive the water, that drives everything. All of this is happening right now, silently, in the dark, without anyone watching, without anyone needing to watch. The ocean does not require an audience. It does not require acknowledgement. It does not require your attention or your fear or your respect or your wonder. It simply continues. And the ships that it holds continue to rest where they fell, and the mysteries that surround those ships continue to exist in the same unresolved state they have existed in for decades or centuries, and none of it, not one element of it, is asking anything of you tonight. Let us come back to the room, to the body, to the specific local personal gravity of a person lying down at the end of a day or in the middle of a night, in a space that is small and warm and dry, and that does not move. The room does not roll. The floor does not list. The walls do not leak. The architecture of ordinary shelter, the walls and roof and floor that separate you from the outside, is so reliable and so constant that you have stopped noticing it, the same way you stop noticing the hum of the refrigerator, or the sound of your own breathing, or the weight of your own eyelids, which is, if you pay attention to it right now, considerable. The eyelids are heavier than they were when this started. The body is heavier. The thoughts are slower, moving through the mind with the kind of thick, unhurried momentum that precedes sleep, the kind of thinking that is more like drifting than like working, more like floating than like swimming. That is good. That is what this was for. There is a particular quality of attention that belongs to the very late hours, and if you are still here, still listening, still lying wherever you have been lying for the duration of these stories, then you know the quality I mean. It is not sharp attention. It is not the kind of attention that solves problems, or makes decisions, or navigates traffic, or responds to emails. It is soft attention, diffuse attention, the kind that does not grab onto things so much as let them pass through, the way a net with very wide holes lets the water through while catching only the largest, slowest things. The details are falling away now, the specific names, the specific dates, the exact tonnage of the manganese ore, or the precise distance between Barbados and the Virginia Capes. These details served their purpose while they were being spoken, anchoring the stories in the real world, giving the mind something concrete to hold on to, while the body did its slow work of settling into rest. But the details are not what stays. What stays is something closer to a feeling, the feeling of a ship on dark water, and the feeling of a question that does not resolve. The feeling of the ocean holding something that no one is going to come back for. This is the last part. Not because the stories are finished, because these stories are never finished. Not really. They persist in the same unresolved state they have persisted in for decades or centuries, and they will continue to persist long after tonight has become yesterday, and yesterday has become last week, and last week has faded into the general past where most of the days go. The stories will be there whenever you want to come back to them. They are patient. They have been patient for a very long time. This is the last part because the night is the last part, or it should be by now, the hour having advanced to whatever hour it has advanced to, in the darkness outside the window, having deepened or held steady or begun, perhaps the very earliest stages of lightning, depending on the time of year and the latitude and the particular relationship between your location on the earth and the position of the sun on the other side of it. The night has its own structure, its own architecture of quiet hours, and somewhere in that architecture there is a room where sleep lives, and the hallway to that room is the one you have been walking down since the beginning of this, slowly, without hurrying, pausing at each doorway to look at what is inside and then moving on. Let us pause at the last doorway. The ships we have talked about tonight span 83 years of human history, from 1872 to 1955. The Mary Celeste sailed in an era of wooden hulls and canvas sails and navigation by sextant and star, and the Joyita sailed in an era of diesel engines and radio communication and a world that had been reshaped by 2 global wars. Between those 2 ships, the technology of seafaring changed enormously. The ships got bigger, the engines got more powerful, the instruments got more precise. The ability to communicate with shore, to call for help, to send a position and a description of the emergency and receive a response, advanced from non-existent to routine, and yet the ocean continued to do what it had always done. Ships continued to disappear. People continue to vanish from vessels that should have carried them safely to their destinations. The technology changed. The outcome in these specific cases did not. This is not a failure of technology. Technology has made the sea vastly safer than it was in the age of sail, and the number of ships lost per voyage has declined by orders of magnitude over the past 2 centuries. Modern weather forecasting, satellite navigation, automated distress beacons, search and rescue coordination, vessel tracking systems, all of these have reduced the risk of maritime travel to a level that would have been unimaginable to the captains and crews of the 19th century. The ocean is safer to cross today than it has ever been, but it is not safe. The distinction matters, and it is the distinction that these stories illuminate. Safer is a relative term. It means the risk has decreased. It does not mean the risk has been eliminated. The ocean remains what it has always been, a body of water that operates on its own terms, that does not negotiate, that does not make exceptions, and that applies the same physics to every vessel, that floats on it regardless of how advanced or well-maintained or carefully navigated that vessel might be. The Mary Celeste was well captained and well crewed and disappeared. The Waratah was brand new and designed to the highest standards of her era and disappeared. The Cyclops was the largest ship of her type in the United States Navy and disappeared. The Joyita was physically incapable of sinking, and her crew disappeared from her anyway. Whatever force or combination of forces caused these outcomes, whether it was weather or structural failure or human error or cargo shifting or any of the dozens of specific theories that have been advanced for each case, the common element is the ocean. The ocean was there for all of them, and the ocean received whatever the outcome was and kept it and moved on. There is a thought that arrives here, slowly, the way the best late-night thoughts arrive, not with the sharp crack of an insight, but with the gradual pressure of something that has been building for a while and is now heavy enough to notice. The thought is this: the ocean does not distinguish between a mystery and an ordinary loss. To the ocean, to the physics of the ocean, there is no difference between a ship that sinks with a full explanation and a ship that sinks with no explanation at all. The water closes over both of them in exactly the same way. The currents disperse the wreckage with exactly the same indifference. The organisms consume the remains with exactly the same patience, and the only place where the distinction between a mystery and an ordinary loss exists is in the human mind, in the stories we tell, in the questions we ask and cannot answer. The mystery is ours. The ocean does not experience mystery. The ocean experiences physics, and the physics, as always, is complete. The ship sank because the forces acting on it exceeded the forces keeping it afloat. The people died because they entered conditions that human biology cannot survive. The wreckage dispersed because the currents carried it. The bodies decomposed because the chemistry of seawater and the biology of marine organisms made decomposition inevitable. Every step in the process is explicable in terms of known physical laws. There is no gap in the physics. The gap is in our knowledge, in our inability to determine which specific combination of forces acted on which specific ship at which specific moment to produce the specific outcome that we cannot explain. The mystery, in other words, is not in the ocean. The mystery is in the distance between what happened and what we know about what happened. That distance, for the ships we have discussed tonight, is very large. It may be permanent. The evidence that would close the distance is at the bottom of the ocean, in the dark, under pressure, being slowly dissolved by the same water that created the mystery in the first place. And the ocean, which has no stake in whether human beings understand what happened aboard the Mary Celeste on November 25th, 1872, or what happened to the Waratah on July 27th, 1909, or where the Cyclops went in March of 1918, or why 25 people left an unsinkable ship in the South Pacific in October of 1955, continues to hold the evidence without offering to share it. This is the condition. Not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be sat with. The ocean holds things that we will never recover. The stories we tell about those things are our attempt to fill the space where the evidence should be, to construct narratives that make sense of the senseless, to impose order on outcomes that were produced by the orderless collision of forces too complex to reconstruct after the fact. And the stories are useful. They give shape to the shapeless. They make the silence speakable. They allow us to sit with the fact of not knowing without being overwhelmed by it, because a story, even an incomplete story, even a story that ends with the words we do not know, is more bearable than silence alone. But tonight, lying here, in the specific quiet of this specific hour, the silence might be bearable too. Not comfortable, not preferable, but bearable. The kind of silence that you can lie next to without needing to fill it. The kind of silence that the ocean produces when it has taken something and is not going to explain. The silence of deep water over a resting wreck. The silence of an Atlantic night in November 1872, after 10 people have left a ship and the ship has sailed on without them and the lifeboat has fallen behind and the distance has become uncrossable and the water is cold and the sky is dark and there is nothing to do except be where you are, which is what you are doing right now, being where you are, in a room in the dark, or in a body that is heavy and warm and increasingly unwilling to maintain the kind of alertness that daytime requires. The muscles have softened, the jaw has loosened, the hands wherever they are have stopped gripping, the feet wherever they are have stopped bracing. The entire apparatus of physical readiness, the tension that the body carries through the waking hours in case it is needed for something, for standing, for walking, for reaching, for responding, has been slowly, over the course of these stories, releasing its hold, not all at once, not completely, but enough that the body is now closer to sleep than it was when the first words were spoken, closer by the margin of an hour or two or however long this has taken, and the margin is sufficient. The margin is the difference between awake and not awake, and the body is on the not awake side of that margin now, or approaching it, or standing at the threshold in the way that the Mary Celeste's crew must have stood at the threshold of the lifeboat, not yet committed to the crossing, but no longer entirely on the ship. The difference is that your crossing is safe. The other side of this threshold is sleep, which is not the ocean, which is not dangerous, which is the body's own way of restoring itself, of consolidating what it has taken in, of repairing what the day has worn down, of letting the mind stop its turning and the thoughts stop their reaching, and the attention stop its scanning and everything, for a few hours. Go quiet. The ships are where they are. The Mary Celeste is on the reef or in the water near the reef. Her timbers mingled with the coral. Her story mingled with the legend that Arthur Conan Doyle helped create when he misspelled her name and gave her a fictional survivor and turned a real maritime tragedy into a piece of Victorian entertainment. She does not mind the misrepresentation. She does not mind anything. She is wood and water and the slow chemistry of the Caribbean. The Waratah is off the coast of South Africa, or she is not, depending on whether the theories are correct, depending on whether Conker really saw her go down from the mouth of the Jura River, depending on whether the flashes the Harlow saw were explosions or lightning or something else entirely. She has been missing for over a century. She will probably be missing for another century. And the families who mourned her passengers have themselves been mourned and buried, and the generations that followed have lived and aged, and the ship remains where it was, unfound, unexplained, a 500-foot question mark resting in the dark. The Cyclops is in the Atlantic. 306 people went down with her, or left her, or whatever the verb is for the thing that happens when a ship and its crew cease to exist simultaneously and without explanation. Franklin Roosevelt signed the document that declared them dead. The world fought the rest of the war, and then another war, and then a Cold War, and then all the other things that the 20th century had in store, and the Cyclops stayed on the bottom through all of it, unmoved by history, unaffected by the passage of time above the surface, and keeping her own counsel in the same way she kept it on that March day in 1918 when she sailed away from Barbados with fair weather and nothing to report and was never heard from again. The Joyita floated. The Joyita survived. The Joyita was found and salvaged and repaired and put back to work and run aground and sold and investigated and written about and eventually scrapped. The ship lived. The 25 people who left her did not. This is the fact that the Joyita leaves you with, the fact that cannot be made comfortable by any amount of context or analysis. The ship did not fail them. They failed to trust the ship, or the ship failed to communicate its trustworthiness to them in the dark, with the water rising and the lights out, and the radio broadcasting to no one. The situation was more complicated than any reconstruction can capture, because it always is, because the moment of decision on a listing ship at night in the Pacific, with a 3-year-old child aboard and blood on the bandages and the pumps not working and the water coming in, is a moment that cannot be reconstructed by anyone who was not there, and everyone who was there is gone. The Orang Medan may not have existed. This is either the strangest part of tonight's stories or the most honest, depending on how you look at it. A ship that may be pure fiction, invented by a journalist or a chain of journalists, embellished by decades of retelling, kept alive by the human need for the ocean to be mysterious. And yet the story persists. The dead crew with their frozen faces. The final message. I die. The explosion that destroys all evidence. It is a perfect horror story, perfectly constructed, with every loose end tied off by the convenient annihilation of the ship and everything aboard it. It is too perfect, really. Reality is not that tidy. Reality leaves loose ends. Reality leaves evidence. The Orang Medan left nothing, which is either because the explosion was thorough or because there was nothing to leave. But the story is here, in the room with you, alongside the other stories, the real ones and the maybe real one and the feelings they have produced, the accumulated weight of the evening's thinking, which is settling now. Settling the way sediment settles on the ocean floor, slowly, evenly, without disturbance, each particle finding its place in the accumulation and resting there. You do not need to remember any of this in the morning. The stories will be here if you want them. The ocean will be here. The ships will be where they are, which is where they have been for decades or centuries, at the bottom of the water, or on the bottom of the record, or in the uncertain space between fact and legend, where the Orang Medan lives. None of it requires your attention. None of it requires your concern. None of it is going to change while you are asleep. The room is warm, or it is cool, or it is whatever temperature rooms are at this hour. The temperature that the body has adjusted to and stopped noticing. The temperature of rest. The sound of the house is the sound of the house at night. The low hum of machinery. The settling of structure. of the distant presence of the world outside continuing to exist without requiring your participation. The water in the pipes has gone wherever water in pipes goes. The darkness outside the window is the darkness of your particular latitude and longitude, the darkness of your particular place on the surface of a planet that is 71% water, a planet whose dominant feature is the thing that took the ships and the people and the answers and held them all in the same darkness that is outside your window right now. The ocean is not going anywhere. The ocean has been here for roughly 4 billion years, give or take, and it will be here for as long as the planet has a climate capable of sustaining liquid water on its surface, which, by current estimates, is several billion years more. And the stories it holds are a tiny fraction of the stories it could tell if it told stories, which it does not, because it is water, and water does not narrate, water does not remember, water does not distinguish between a famous ship and an unknown one, between a captain who was loved and a captain who was feared, between a voyage that ended safely and a voyage that ended in silence. The water holds them all the same. The water holds them all. And now it is time to let the water hold this too. This evening. This collection of stories and silences and questions that will not be answered tonight or any night. This specific arrangement of words that was built to carry you from wakefulness towards sleep, from the lit room of attention toward the dark water of rest, and from the part of the night where the mind is still reaching toward the part where it stops reaching and simply floats. You are floating now, or close to it. The body has been releasing its grip for a long time slowly, one muscle group at a time, the way a crew abandons a ship, not all at once but gradually, each member making their own private decision that it is time to stop holding on. The shoulders went first probably, then the jaw, then the hands, then the specific muscles around the eyes that maintain the expression you wear during the day, the expression of alertness, of engagement, of being ready. That expression is gone now, or going. The face is doing what faces do in the dark when no one is watching, which is nothing, which is rest. The ocean is out there, the ships are where they are, the silence is complete, and the silence is not empty, and the silence is not frightening, and the silence is not asking you to do anything about it. The silence is just the sound the world makes when the questions have been asked, and the answers have not come, and the night has gone on long enough that the distinction between knowing and not knowing has stopped mattering, at least for now, at least until morning, at least for the duration of the crossing from here to sleep. Weather fair. All well. If this found you somewhere quiet and something in it settled, a subscribe helps more people find their way here. And if you know someone who sleeps best with the sound of a story in the dark, send this to them. That is how this kind of work finds the people it was made for. Good night. The ocean will still be there in the morning. It always is.